Chapter 361, A New Beginning. As March arrived, the recent weekend events brought a sense of redemption for Oliver Wood and the entire Gryffindor Quidditch team. Gryffindor had triumphed over Ravenclaw at the start of the term, and now Ravenclaw had defeated Hufflepuff. This turn of events gave Gryffindor another chance to claim the championship, despite last term's setback due to the Dementor disturbances. The Gryffindor common room was filled with joy, and even Harry found a brief respite from the grim news of Peter Pettigrew's accidental death, which had been the subject of an ongoing investigation by the Daily Prophet. Monday afternoon's potions class was unusually pleasant, likely because Draco Malfoy had finally returned to school, and Snape seemed less inclined to torment Harry. The two potions classes passed without incident. As the students emerged from the dim basement into the bright afternoon, the air was crisp and refreshing, a welcome change from the harsh winter cold, with summer's heat still a few months away. On the lawn by the forest's edge, many young wizards practiced their flying skills, eager to contribute to their house teams in the future. "Go get your firebolt and nimbus, Harry. We can join in," Ron exclaimed with enthusiasm as the Gryffindors exited the foyer and stood atop the marble staircase, overlooking the jubilant scene on the verdant lawn. It was unusual. Harry, who was typically the most enthusiastic about Quidditch, seemed only mildly interested this time. "Well, good idea, Ron," he replied absently, glancing toward the school gate. "You know where I keep them. You can fetch them." Ron, oblivious to Harry's distraction, eagerly accepted the task. He, Seamus, and Neville turned and dashed up the stairs, seizing the rare opportunity. Meanwhile, Hermione, who had been diligently absorbing knowledge since leaving the basement, snapped her book shut. She took a deep breath of the fresh evening air and looked at Harry. "Want to talk to me, Harry?" "Oh!" Harry was momentarily startled. "Well, what do you want to talk about?" Instead of lingering at the door, they descended the stairs, bypassing the group of young wizards practicing on the lawn, and headed toward the lake. The breeze played gently across the fields, and the waves on the vast black lake shimmered like layers of golden silk under the setting sun. They settled on a small rise about 50 feet from the lake, and Hermione reopened her well-worn book, her eyes scanning the pages intently. "You've been reading that book a lot lately. What's it about?" Harry asked, curious. It was odd that Hermione had suggested a chat, but remained engrossed in her book. Seeking to break the silence, he initiated the conversation. "A simplified theory of ancient charms," Hermione replied, showing him the cover. "The content is quite profound, especially the notes, but I've started finding it fascinating." She brushed a stray lock of hair from her face and spoke softly. "This is the one Professor Blaine gave you?" Harry realized. Hermione nodded, still absorbed in the book's gentle script. Her brows furrowed slightly in concentration, and after a long pause, she turned the page. "You've been in a bad mood lately, Harry," Hermione said directly. "Are you still thinking about the Dark Wizard? Who killed Peter?" Harry pursed his lips, hesitating before responding. Hermione's guess wasn't entirely wrong, but it was incomplete. The shocking news published by the Daily Prophet had caused an uproar throughout the wizarding world, even reaching the usually detached Hogwarts campus. Everyone was buzzing about who had killed Peter Pettigrew, who had transformed overnight from a celebrated war hero to a despised traitor. The prevailing theory was that one of you-know-who's former followers had murdered Pettigrew. After the Dark Lord's fall, most of his loyal Dark Wizards were imprisoned in Azkaban. However, a few had managed to remain hidden, their past misdeeds undiscovered. Pettigrew, having replaced Sirius Black as the Dark Lord's most trusted minion, likely knew their identities. Fearing he would betray them to lessen his own punishment, it was only logical for these wizards to act preemptively and eliminate him. Pettigrew met his end en route to Azkaban, a significant embarrassment for the Ministry of Magic. This incident shattered the competent image the Ministry had painstakingly built during the Greyback affair. The Minister of Magic and other high-ranking officials were incensed, vowing to identify the murderer within a month. However, those familiar with the Ministry's history were skeptical, suspecting this case would remain unsolved. Barty Crouch found himself in a fortunate position. Although criticized for mistakenly imprisoning Sirius Black, the sudden turn of events diverted much of the scrutiny away from him. His firm stance in the Wizengamot trial court helped him retain his role as the head of the Department of International Magical Cooperation, much to Cornelius Fudge's chagrin. Harry and his friends had been speculating about Pettigrew's killer for some time. Their primary suspect was Lucius Malfoy, though they needed no specific reason to distrust him. The potions professor, Severus Snape, was also under suspicion. How else could one explain Snape's unusually kind demeanor following Pettigrew's demise? Hermione even mused that Snape might regret not having killed Pettigrew himself, a theory not entirely unfounded. Since Professor Lupin's departure that fateful night, he hadn't returned to Hogwarts. Rumors circulated that he could no longer hold the position of Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. This wasn't entirely unexpected, as no one had held the post for more than a year in recent times. However, it was surprising that Lupin's tenure ended after just half a year. Many students speculated that Atticus Blaine would step in to fill the vacancy, given his previous stint substituting for Lupin and his steady performance in the role. Yet, this was mere conjecture. Shortly after the defeat of Greyback and his werewolf gang, Blaine had left Hogwarts and hadn't returned. Professor Dumbledore had briefly reappeared at the school, only to vanish again soon after. Despite these disruptions, life at Hogwarts continued much as it always had. Even when they were away, and the teaching and activities continued unaffected, Harry couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. It seemed to him that without them at Hogwarts, the school felt more than half empty. Yet, he kept this feeling to himself, not even confiding in Hermione. She had been labeled cowardly for a while after the Dementor incident last term, and he didn't want to burden her further. Yes, it is indeed puzzling, isn't it? Harry sighed, his voice tinged with dejection. Could it be that Malfoy's father hired someone to eliminate the traitor? I kind of missed the taste of Polyjuice Potion, Hermione. I should have kept some spare. The last time they used Polyjuice Potion, it hadn't been a pleasant experience for Hermione. She looked up from her book, casting an irritated glance at Harry, ready to retort. But before she could speak, two figures caught her attention, leaving her momentarily speechless and bewildered. Professor Snape and McGonagall? Hermione murmured, frowning as she watched the black wizard's robe billow like a bat across the lawn. The compact figure beside it seemed to be heading towards the Forbidden Forest. What could they be doing there? She wondered aloud, her curiosity piqued. End of this chapter. Chapter 362. What are Professor Snape and Professor McGonagall doing in the Forbidden Forest? Atticus Blaine and Hermione exchanged glances, their eyes wide with astonishment. The heads of two Hogwarts houses seemed to be dealing with something urgent. They hurried along, ignoring the curious stares of the young wizards around them, and quickly disappeared along the edge of the Forbidden Forest. In no time, their figures blurred into the distance. "Harry!" Hermione exclaimed, leaping up from the grass alongside Atticus. Her voice was filled with nervous energy. "I'm on it," Atticus replied, immediately grasping Hermione's intent. He was relieved he hadn't returned to the dormitory with Ron. Without the invisibility cloak, Atticus knew his tracking skills were insufficient to follow the two professors. He retrieved the cloak from his school bag, glanced around to ensure they were unobserved, and draped it over both himself and Hermione. Together, they sprinted in the direction Snape and Professor McGonagall had taken. "I bet Ron will regret missing something important again," Atticus remarked. "Not necessarily, Atticus," Hermione panted, struggling with her bulging school bag. "You know what we're doing is against school rules. Maybe Ron will be lucky enough to avoid detention." Despite her words, Hermione followed Atticus without hesitation, determined to uncover the mystery. What could have prompted Snape and Professor McGonagall to act so urgently? If it had been only Snape heading into the Forbidden Forest, Atticus might have had more theories. But with Professor McGonagall accompanying him, many of his assumptions fell apart. 5 minutes later, the figures of the two professors became clearer to the young wizards trailing them. Atticus and Hermione slowed their pace, wary of the crunching leaves that might alert the professors to their presence. Snape and McGonagall weren't rushing into the depths of the Forbidden Forest. Instead, they moved steadily toward the intersection of the lake and the forest's edge. 10 minutes later, as the noise from the Hogwarts courtyard faded completely, the professors unexpectedly veered onto a narrow but navigable path leading into the forest. I never knew there was such a place in the Forbidden Forest. Maybe even Fred and George haven't been here. Atticus whispered in awe from beneath the invisibility cloak. The forest path, though blanketed with fallen leaves, appeared strangely pristine under the red-gold glow of the setting sun. Tall pine trees flanked the path, their trunks bathed in golden light from the sun hovering just above the horizon. Behind them, the gentle lapping of the Black Lake's waters harmonized with the ethereal sounds of the forest. Insects and birds chirped, creating an atmosphere that made Atticus and Hermione feel as if they had stepped into a fairy tale. "Hush! Keep your voice down, Atticus, or they'll hear us," Hermione cautioned, her eyes catching sight of moss-covered stellies amidst the lush grass on either side of the path. She couldn't help but sigh. These must be very old. Prompted by Hermione's observation, Atticus turned his attention to the ancient steles. He quickly realized why Hermione was so moved. The stone monuments were actually tombstones, their surfaces overgrown with green vines. The inscriptions, worn by time and weather, were barely legible. Hermione studied the tombstones, her curiosity piqued by their history. Hermione's face gradually turned pale as a dreadful suspicion formed in her mind. The once amiable surroundings now felt cold and unwelcoming. Her lips trembled, and each breath of air seemed to chill her to the bone. "Who could it be, Harry?" she whispered, turning to look at Harry. She noticed his face was equally troubled and realized he shared her suspicion. "Could it be? Would it be? You see, Professor Snape and Professor McGonagall, they're the heads. Could it be, Harry?" "Absolutely impossible," Harry replied, his face ashen. Though he didn't know the answer, he spoke with firm conviction. The two leading professors, Snape and McGonagall, remained silent, their expressions somber as they hurried along the path with determined efficiency. After a few minutes, Professor McGonagall spotted a spacious, garden-like circular area ahead. "I see them, Severus," she exclaimed excitedly. The two professors quickened their pace, rushing toward the gathering. In the garden stood Dumbledore, Atticus Blaine, Sirius, and Remus Lupin, who lay on a stretcher. Creature, the loyal house elf from the Black family, was also present. Regulus Black, forever youthful in appearance, lay among them. "You arrived so quickly, Professor Snape and Professor McGonagall," Atticus said, wiping sweat from his brow. He tucked his wand back into his sleeve and smiled at the panting professors. "I just finished tidying up here." "We came as soon as Albus informed us, Atticus," Professor McGonagall replied, clutching her chest. Her gaze fell upon Regulus Black, who lay peacefully on a piece of green velvet. Her expression turned sorrowful, and her eyes glistened with unshed tears. The garden, meticulously arranged by Atticus, resembled a fairyland, yet the atmosphere was far from enchanting. Dumbledore stood with his hands folded, his expression grave. Remus mirrored Dumbledore's solemnity, though a hint of guilt shadowed his features. Understandable, given he was the only one lying down for the funeral. Sirius sat beside his younger brother, his face tense and twitching as he struggled to maintain composure. Creature, however, was unrestrained in his grief. The elf lay beneath the table, supporting Regulus's body, his inaudible sobs suggesting he had been crying for hours. Snape, who had known Regulus at Hogwarts, recalled their interactions. Though he had never been fond of Regulus due to his connection with Sirius, they had communicated more after leaving Hogwarts to follow the Dark Lord. Regulus's sudden disappearance had gone unnoticed by Snape, who now found himself confronting the reality of Regulus's fate. Regulus Black lay on the table, his face ashen yet serene in death. Snape stared at him, lost in thought. In a moment of introspection, he wondered, "Can I be freed?" The question pierced his heart, and he turned his gaze to the stretcher. Remus, wrapped in white bandages, was trying to lift his head, a hint of mischief in his eyes. "Now that you're here, Harry and Hermione, come over and bid farewell to this heroic spirit embarking on his journey," Atticus called, gesturing toward a towering tree nearby. Dumbledore, who had noticed it earlier, smiled. Under the astonished gaze of the others, the space at the tree's roots began to twist and shimmer. Two small heads emerged, each wearing an expression of embarrassment. End of this chapter. Chapter 363, The Funeral. As expected, when Harry and Hermione spotted Professor Dumbledore and Atticus Blaine amidst the crowd, they realized their attempts at concealment were futile. Since Harry had received the precious invisibility cloak during his first Christmas at Hogwarts, this was the only wizard who could see through its disguise. "Potter and Granger?" Professor McGonagall exclaimed in surprise as she noticed the two young wizards approaching. "How did you find out?" "It's quite obvious, Minerva," Professor Snape interjected with a sarcastic sneer. The two Gryffindors had been following the professors rather conspicuously, and now they stood exposed before the headmaster. Professor McGonagall sighed, ready to reprimand them, but at that moment, Sirius turned around and waved kindly at Harry and Hermione. "Come here, Harry. And you must be Hermione, right? Remus told Atticus and me about you," Sirius said warmly. Hermione blushed with embarrassment, but followed Harry as they approached Sirius. Harry observed Sirius closely. There was a lingering sadness in his eyes, yet he looked much healthier than he had a month ago in the Forbidden Forest. The man before him was a far cry from the criminal in prison garb with a vicious expression. Instead, he resembled the handsome young wizard in the photo album Hagrid had given Harry, a man closer to his parents. Sirius placed a hand on Harry's shoulder naturally, and Harry felt no discomfort, as if they had known each other for years. In reality, they had only met once before, and that was under the cloud of misunderstanding. The breeze whispered softly, and the golden light and shadows cast by the setting sun danced through the leaves on the ground. Dumbledore's voice, deep and resonant, broke the silence. "That's all there is to it, Sirius," he said apologetically. "I understand your desire to hold a grand funeral for your brother, but as I explained, it's not appropriate to publicly reveal Regulus's stance and his sacrifice in fighting Voldemort. It involves secrets too important for public knowledge." "Your brother?" Harry asked instinctively. Yet, upon seeing the young wizard lying before him, he had already guessed. He initially thought the wizard might be Sirius's son or nephew, given their striking resemblance. But dying for fighting Voldemort? Harry was shocked. To the public, Voldemort had been dead for 12 years. Even if he wasn't, he was believed to be long gone. However, Harry and his friends knew otherwise. A professor had attempted to steal the Philosopher's Stone from Hogwarts. Could Voldemort have made a similar move recently, leading to Sirius's brother's sacrifice? "I've run out of ideas, Dumbledore," Sirius admitted, "but I think Regulus would be satisfied." Creature's wailing suddenly grew sharper, and Harry and Hermione noticed another presence hidden beneath the table. "Dobby, how could you— Oh, you're not!" Harry blurted out, realizing his mistake. The house elf before him wasn't Dobby. Though he couldn't pinpoint the subtle differences in their features, he could tell this elf was much older. "It's Creature, the loyal servant of the Black family," Sirius explained to Harry. As the only surviving direct descendant of the Black family, Sirius's approval held significant meaning for Creature. The old creature wept bitterly, pounding the ground as he muttered incessantly. Hermione, witnessing Creature's tears, felt a pang of sympathy. The mention of the word servant made her purse her lips, as if she wanted to voice her thoughts. "I don't think you've grasped the situation, Harry," Sirius said, placing an arm around Harry's shoulders with a sad smile. "Regulus Black was my true brother. He made some mistakes in the past, but once he realized them, he chose to make amends. He paid for those choices with his life. This isn't recent. He's been gone for many years." Harry nodded, piecing together the information with what Dumbledore had previously shared. "I didn't know the full story before," Sirius continued. "I thought he was Ted fastly following Voldemort. After escaping from Azkaban with Atticus Blaine's help, I uncovered the truth about his death. Although it's too late, I still wish to give Regulus a proper funeral." Hermione and Harry exchanged glances, recalling their encounters with Professor Blaine. He was a particularly remarkable wizard, seemingly connected to everything, and always capable of overcoming any challenge. The funeral commenced, with everyone gathered in a circle around the unsung hero. Faces were solemn as Dumbledore began, each person expressing admiration for Regulus's bravery in defying Voldemort. Those who knew Regulus Black reminisced about the past. Even Snape, who considered Sirius his nemesis, managed a few terse words. Atticus Blaine waved his wand, and brilliant white flames erupted from Regulus's body and the surrounding table. The flames soared higher, enveloping the body. As white smoke spiraled into the air, everyone seemed to glimpse a handsome young man with a roguish smile, waving to them from above. When it was all over, the sun had set, leaving only a somber red glow clinging to the horizon. Snape departed swiftly, the occasion clearly unsettling for him. Potter, Granger, for trailing the professor. Professor McGonagall's stern voice broke the silence as they stood by the shimmering lake. You must report to Filch for further instructions upon returning to the castle. Professor McGonagall was known for her strictness, and Harry and Hermione had anticipated this outcome. Still, Harry felt uneasy about losing points and facing detention in front of so many, especially the headmaster. Hermione, embarrassed, wished she could disappear into the nearby Black Lake. I believe this punishment is quite fitting, Dumbledore remarked, his silver beard fluttering in the breeze. He noticed Harry's furtive glances and added with a touch of humor. The group chuckled softly. Even Sirius managed a slight smile despite his heavy heart. It's not a big deal, Sirius reassured Harry, patting him with admiration. If I get the chance, I'll share some tales of our adventures with James's invisibility cloak. Please don't make me regret my decision, Sirius, Dumbledore said with mild exasperation. You must understand that a professor's role extends beyond teaching. It's about setting an example and guiding the students. Professor? Harry's mind stalled for a moment as he processed the exchange between Dumbledore and Sirius. He first displayed an expression of surprise. Atticus Blaine wore an expression of disbelief, but then with a smile of surprise, he looked down at Sirius. As you guessed, Harry, Sirius nodded, confirming the truth. Some people, Atticus, who had been aware of this for quite some time, shook his head with a knowing smile. Always seemed to lack the ability to learn from the lessons of those who came before them. End of this chapter. Chapter 364, The New Professor. Those who have studied at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry for several years know that once more than one person learns about something, it spreads throughout the school at varying speeds, depending on how sensational it is. The latest buzz was that Sirius Black was set to replace Professor Lupin as the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor for the next few months. Since Harry and Hermione found out, the news had reached about 70% of the students within half an hour of dinner. The remaining 30% were mostly 5th and 7th year students who were too engrossed in preparing for their crucial exams to pay attention to the gossip. Just half a month ago, Sirius Black was a notorious fugitive, the first wizard to ever escape from Azkaban. Last school year, Dementors were stationed at Hogsmeade and the school gates to capture him. Yet, in a mere fortnight, the roles of villain and hero had reversed. Peter Pettigrew, once awarded the Order of Merlin First Class, was now a criminal, while Sirius Black, who had languished in Azkaban for 12 years, emerged as a hero. Now, he was to be their Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. Damn, what did I miss? Ron exclaimed, frustrated, at the Gryffindor table. On the night of the werewolf confrontation, Ron had missed the magical time travel due to his injuries. Now, he had just gone back to the dormitory to fetch his firebolt and missed another significant event. The other Gryffindor students, unaware of Ron's outburst, focused their wide-eyed attention on the staff table, where a handsome, middle-aged wizard with a hint of melancholy in his eyes was conversing with Professor McGonagall. At Christmas, my grandma told me that if I ever met Sirius, I should fight him, even if it meant losing my life, to uphold my parents' honor. Neville said, his round cheeks flushed with excitement. Now, I can't wait to hear what she'll say when she finds out about this. You can't duel a professor, Neville, Harry said, his excitement barely contained. Since hearing the news, he felt as if every student had cast a happiness spell on him. It was unbelievable that Sirius Black, his godfather, was now a professor at the school. Harry was curious about how Dumbledore had come up with the idea. Previously, he thought Professor Atticus Blaine might step in. Now, Snape couldn't act with impunity, could he? Unless he wanted to see Slytherin students treated in Defense Against the Dark Arts like Gryffindors were in potions. Although Harry hadn't known Sirius well before today, he was confident that Sirius would look out for Gryffindor students. Shock, Disbelief, anger, and hatred filled the air. Snape had left in a hurry after attending the funeral of Sirius's younger brother, Regulus Black, a young hero. He was still unaware that Sirius had become the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. The tension between them was evident from Sirius's expression when he entered the Great Hall and sat at the staff table. "Do you think," Seamus said, barely containing his excitement like Neville, "he might tell us how he escaped from Azkaban? If we learned that, we wouldn't have to fear it anymore. Not that I'm planning on going to Azkaban." The conversation quickly shifted to a discussion about how Sirius had managed to escape from Azkaban, a topic that fascinated everyone. Topic had been a hot one over the past year. Perhaps Professor Black, like Professor Blaine, has a particularly powerful Patronus. He must have used that magic to drive away all the Dementors, Lavender exclaimed in surprise. "Well, he'd need a wand first," Hermione interjected, closing the book Professor Blaine had given her. Hearing her roommate's far-fetched theories, she retorted, "Besides, I don't see the point in discussing it." The young wizards around them, including Harry and Ron, stared at Hermione in astonishment, as if she had uttered something unbelievable. Realizing she had become the center of attention, Hermione took a deep breath, sipped her drink, curled her lips, rolled her eyes, and shook her head. "Think about it," she continued. "No matter how Sirius escaped from Azkaban, the Ministry of Magic won't rest until they figure it out. They'll definitely take precautions, right? There's no way they'd leave a loophole unless they want Azkaban to be unable to hold prisoners anymore." A collective sigh rose from the middle of the Gryffindor table under the astonished gazes of students from the other 3 tables. "And I don't understand why you're so excited, Harry," Hermione said, squinting at him like everyone else, as if she was contemplating a future visit to Azkaban to study Harry. "Are you crazy, Hermione? That's Sirius Black, Harry's godfather," Ron exclaimed in surprise. "I bet he'll treat Malfoy the same way that old Bat Snape treats Harry. We've waited so many years for such a hero to appear, and even Professor Blaine won't help us like that." Harry nodded vigorously. "Don't forget." Hermione glanced at Sirius at the staff table. "He's the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor, and we all know that for some reason, those professors are always prone to accidents." Harry's smile faltered, and he slapped his forehead in frustration. "Damn it, I forgot about that. Sirius has been wrongly imprisoned by the Ministry of Magic for so many years. He must not know the situation. Should I remind him?" "Take it easy, mate," Ron frowned. "We all know the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor's job isn't easy, but it's not without hope, is it?" "You mean Professor Blaine?" Harry's eyes lit up. "Of course," Ron said thoughtfully, glancing at Professor Blaine, who was elegantly cutting his lamb chops at the staff table. "If it weren't for Sirius, we might never have figured out Scabbers." Thinking of Peter Pettigrew, who had been hiding in plain sight, Ron turned pale and shivered. "We can't just let Sirius follow in Professor Lupin's footsteps, right, Harry? If I were you, I'd ask Professor Blaine how he avoided those misfortunes." Atticus Blaine, who was dining, suddenly felt several pairs of eager eyes on him. He looked up calmly and found Harry and the others staring at him intently. He frowned, trying to guess why these particularly inquisitive students were focused on him again, but then shook his head, deciding not to dwell on it. At the staff table, most professors welcomed Sirius Black's sudden addition to their ranks, though there were exceptions. When Sirius was a student, Professor McGonagall was already the head of Gryffindor. No one knew better than her the trouble Sirius and his friends had caused. She was relieved that Sirius hadn't betrayed the Potters, but the thought of him teaching young wizards left her feeling uneasy. And as for Snape, well, that was another story entirely. The grievances between the so-called teammates who once fought against Greyback and his werewolves together are nothing compared to the deep-seated animosities they harbored. While it is true that Sirius did not betray Lily, Snape could never forget that it was Sirius who foolishly suggested the plan that led to Lily's death. Over the years, Sirius, with his knack for communication, had gleaned bits of information about Severus from various conversations. It was all for the sake of James and Lily's son. To be honest, given these old and new resentments, the two might have clashed on another occasion. Even now, as their eyes inadvertently met, the palpable hostility between them was undeniable. Just as Professor McGonagall was reprimanding Sirius, the timely sound of a silver spoon tapping against a glass rang out. Dumbledore's action brought the noise in the auditorium to a gradual hush. With a smile that reflected in the eyes of hundreds of onlookers, Dumbledore addressed the assembly. "Allow me to introduce our new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor," he announced, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "But I suppose you're already familiar with him, aren't you?" End of this chapter. Chapter 3 and 65, New Courses. The three young wizards from Slytherin House, who had been injured in a series of incidents, had finally recovered and were discharged from the hospital. Meanwhile, the esteemed and beloved Headmaster Dumbledore, along with the recently renowned Professor Atticus Blaine, returned to their respective posts. Of particular note was the appointment of Sirius Black, who had garnered much attention over the past year, as the new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor at Hogwarts. These significant changes, all occurring overnight, had the young wizards buzzing with excitement. Despite having indulged in a feast of delicious food, they lingered in the Great Hall, reluctant to leave. Their eyes were fixed on the staff table, where Professor Black, his smile unwavering throughout the evening, was engaged in conversation with other faculty members about the upcoming Defense Against the Dark Arts classes. There was much speculation among the students. Would Professor Black teach them how to escape from Azkaban? Surely, he wouldn't ignore the injustices Harry faced in potions class. What actions would he take? Would he confront Professor Snape, perhaps even dunking him in the Black Lake to wash his hair? These thoughts sparked lively debates among the students. Ron, in particular, had great faith in Sirius. He confidently declared that Sirius would indeed push the old bat's head into the lake to avenge Harry, even though he had witnessed Snape's prowess in dealing with werewolves in the Forbidden Forest. Harry, meanwhile, had been watching the faculty table all night, his gaze lingering on Dumbledore, Professor Blaine, and Sirius. An unprecedented sense of security filled his heart, bringing him immense joy. Even though he knew Sirius probably couldn't make Snape wash his hair in the Black Lake, Ron's vivid description amused him. New colleagues warranted attention. While Sirius was at the staff table, Atticus was engaged in a serious discussion with Dumbledore about an important matter. "The first and second-year students are still building their foundations," Atticus explained. "I don't plan to involve them just yet. It's more appropriate to start with the third years. The third and fourth years, along with the older students, need to focus on their Owls and Newts exams, which will demand much of their energy. However, once a routine is established, the senior and talented young wizards can join my intensive class based on their personal interests." Dumbledore listened intently, his expression serious. "Do you think this is necessary, Atticus? My perspective leans towards organizing it as a club, similar to Minerva's Transfiguration Club or Severus Potion Club. This approach is more traditional at Hogwarts and easier for students to accept." Atticus fell silent, gazing down at the jubilant Great Hall filled with smiling young faces. After a moment, he continued to persuade Dumbledore patiently. "It's necessary, Headmaster Dumbledore. Hogwarts must teach them real skills, skills that truly enable them to protect themselves. As times change, magic increasingly serves daily life, which is fine, but some ancient skills should not be forgotten." Snape had left the Great Hall midway through dinner. After Atticus convinced Dumbledore to accept his new course, he glanced at Sirius, who was thoroughly enjoying himself, and quietly retreated from the table. As soon as he stepped out of the Great Hall, the bustling noise faded away, leaving the world in silence. Atticus was in no rush to return to his office. Instead, he ascended a few floors via the spiral staircase, contemplating the future of his new course. Atticus Blaine walked aimlessly along the quiet, ancient, and mysterious corridors of Hogwarts. The light from the torches hanging on the stone walls melded with the bright moonlight, while the evening breeze drifted comfortably between the rows of buildings, brushing the edge of the Forbidden Forest. Hagrid, who was tending to Fang, had already lit the candles in his cabin, and Hogwarts had returned to its familiar peace and tranquility. Perhaps it was the serene atmosphere of Hogwarts that Atticus, who had been entangled in mundane affairs recently, found so comforting. He had been reflecting on his conversation with Dumbledore in the Great Hall, and it was Draco's request during a visit to the hospital that prompted him to advance his plans. The wizarding world had enjoyed a long period of peace, and most wizards, born and raised in this environment, excelled in magic related to their work, often neglecting offensive skills. During this time, Atticus had been in close contact with the Ministry of Magic. He observed that, despite having hundreds of employees, the Ministry's ability to handle conflicts was limited. Only a dozen or so aurors, led by Rufus Scrimgeour, could be considered an armed force. According to ancient wizarding standards, these aurors were merely official wizards, with only 2 or 3 approaching the level of court wizards. Atticus realized that the British wizarding world had avoided major disturbances largely due to Dumbledore's presence. However, he knew that luck would not always favor them, and eventually they would face challenges they could not ignore. Both Dumbledore and Atticus were cautious about training young wizards in combat skills. While it seemed beneficial to enhance their self-protection abilities, it also meant exposing them to the harsh realities of conflict. These young wizards deserve protection, yet the magical world lacked the means to shield them in severe conflicts, leaving them to fend for themselves. "Good evening, Professor Blaine," a youthful yet ethereal voice suddenly greeted him as he passed through the arched windows, lost in thought. "Good evening, Miss Lovegood," Atticus replied absent-mindedly, continuing to walk forward. However, after a few steps, he stopped abruptly. Turning back, he observed the young witch by the window, gazing intently at the night sky with a curious expression. For a wizard like Atticus, moving silently was second nature. He had made no sound as he passed behind the young witch. So, how had she noticed him? Intrigued, Atticus took a few steps back and gently asked, "How did you know I was passing behind you, Miss Lovegood?" "It was the gadfly who told me, Professor Blaine," Luna replied, turning to face him. Atticus noticed a necklace made of butterbeer bottle caps hanging around her neck. "What?" Atticus frowned, puzzled. "The harassing gadfly," Luna explained. "They are always buzzing around my ears. Just now, when you approached, they let me know." "They all flew away. I suppose they're quite afraid of you." Atticus Blaine surveyed the surroundings with eyes attuned to detecting magical energies, yet he found no trace of any magical creatures that might be concealing themselves. If it weren't for the sincere gleam in Luna's silver eyes, Atticus might have suspected the young witch of playing tricks on him and bothering Gadfly. As he observed the young witch before him, who exuded a cool and ethereal aura, Atticus's eyebrows arched slightly, and a peculiar light flickered in his eyes. "Well, if I recall correctly, Miss Lovegood, you're a second-year student at Ravenclaw, aren't you?" Upon receiving her affirmative response, Atticus nodded thoughtfully. "That's right, Miss Lovegood. I've recently been planning an unprecedented teaching course for young wizards in the 3rd and 4th grades. I believe you possess extraordinary talents. Would you be interested in participating?" End of this chapter. Chapter 366. Upon returning to his office, Atticus Blaine found his thoughts lingering on the young Ravenclaw wizard, Luna Lovegood, whom he had encountered earlier. Weighing factors such as safety, ability, and time, Atticus decided to include 3rd and 4th year students in his new curriculum. However, Luna's presence reminded him that there were many talented students in other grades as well, deserving of opportunities to grow. Having taught defense against the dark arts, Atticus was familiar with most of the students at Hogwarts, except for those who had just started the previous year. For 2 hours, he sat quietly under the steady glow of candlelight, occasionally jotting down names on the parchment before him. By the time the moon was high in the sky, the parchment was filled with names. Yet, his task was far from complete. Atticus needed teaching materials for his new course and had no intention of using the existing magic books available. He resolved to compile a new textbook and corresponding teaching plan himself, ensuring that the class could continue even if he were to leave Hogwarts. A sudden knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Atticus looked up and, recognizing the visitors, smiled wryly. "Come in, all 3 of you," he called. Few students dared to roam the castle outside of designated hours, and even fewer had the courage to knock on his office door. Unsurprisingly, it was the small group of Gryffindors. Harry, Ron, and Hermione felt a mix of anxiety and excitement as they entered Professor Blaine's office. Their eyes were immediately drawn to the wall behind the door, which was usually concealed by a large black curtain. For a moment, they were speechless. Where did those surveillance images go? Atticus asked, tucking the parchment into a drawer and stretching his stiff muscles. Noticing their puzzled expressions, he chuckled. His office was perhaps the simplest among all the professors, yet everyone who entered couldn't help but notice the wall, a secret to most students, used for monitoring the school. Atticus waved his wand, and 3 cups of steaming milk appeared on the coffee table. To ensure you get a good night's sleep, I'll offer you hot milk instead of tea. You wouldn't want to miss Professor Black's Defense Against the Dark Arts class due to illness, he said with a smile. Actually, we think you'd make a great coach, Harry grinned as they settled onto the sofa. Ron, however, couldn't take his eyes off the now normal wall, looking as if he wanted to say something. It's not legal to monitor the school like that, Atticus explained. It was a special measure for an emergency. Once Sirius was proven innocent, Headmaster Dumbledore reminded me to dismantle it, so you probably won't see it here again. Oh, Ron shrugged. Fred and George will be disappointed. They've been curious about it. Atticus was aware of the Weasley twins' interest. They had even attempted to replicate the surveillance system in private, though without success. With their own ingenuity, they had also developed alchemical props similar to those Atticus Blaine had encountered in Filch's office. Before diving into the main topic, a bit of chatter was inevitable. Harry, Ron, and Hermione were eager to know about the Ministry of Magic's progress in investigating the murder of Peter Pettigrew. Atticus couldn't reveal to them that Peter had been deliberately targeted. Well, Atticus began thoughtfully, the Ministry of Magic hasn't made any groundbreaking discoveries yet. However, from what I gather, they suspect that insiders were involved in the murder. Insiders? The revelation left the trio stunned. Hermione quickly pieced it together. According to the Daily Prophet, Peter Pettigrew died on his way to Azkaban, which implies someone on the inside must have leaked information. Oh, Ron exclaimed with a grimace. Dad always said the Ministry of Magic is like a sieve, but I never thought they'd mess up something like this. Honestly, though, he got what he deserved, didn't he? The thought of Ving kept a criminal-turned-rat as a pet for years was something Ron preferred to forget. Harry's feelings about Peter's death were complex. This man had not only orphaned him, but also caused Sirius to suffer unjustly. From a justice standpoint, Peter's fate seemed fitting. Yet, Harry wondered if his father would have wanted Peter to die so miserably. As Harry pondered this, the office buzzer rang again, startling the trio. Besides them, the only person likely to visit Professor Blaine at this hour would be another professor, perhaps Professor McGonagall or Professor Dumbledore. Harry and Hermione were still under detention for following the professor. Don't worry, Atticus reassured the nervous trio with a smile. It's Professor Black. I think he's retained some of his student days' bad habits, like wandering around at night. Sorry to bother you so late, Atticus. Sirius Black entered, more courteous than before, after recent events. He knew it was impolite to intrude at such an hour, and promptly apologized. I was just going through the materials Remus left in the office, reviewing the learning progress for each grade. Classes start tomorrow, and I need to digest everything tonight. In that case, Atticus gestured to the bird cage in Sirius's hands. Why not read the materials quietly in your office? Why come to me with a bird cage in the middle of the night? Sirius was about to explain when he noticed the 3 awkward young wizards by the sofa. Surprised, he smiled. Oh, it's you 3. What brings you to Atticus's office? Sirius winked and approached Harry, patting his shoulder. Were you on an adventure and got caught by Filch, then sent to Atticus? You should have more faith in your godson's night-traveling skills, Sirius, Atticus remarked, retreating to his seat behind the desk as the couch was full. About this owl, Sirius began, sitting down. Since you're all here, it's convenient. I got it for you, Ron. For me? Ron's eyes widened as he glanced at the cooing little owl in the cage, then back at Professor Black. Yes, I pre-ordered it a few days ago. Today, the post office delivered it directly to my office. It's probably excited about the new environment, and I need some peace and quiet now. Sirius explained with a smile. Consider it compensation, Ron. I know from Crookshanks that you valued that Scabbers mouse. You lost him because of me, Ron said, puffing up his cheeks in surprise. Although he didn't voice his opinion, his astonishment was evident to everyone. The Weasley family was financially constrained, owning only one shared owl, and none of Ron's older brothers had ever suggested that Ginny should have her own pet. Take it, Ron. Hedwig will be delighted to have a new friend, Harry said cheerfully. Ron hesitated, his face flushed with uncertainty, but under the encouraging gazes of Harry and Hermione, he finally nodded shyly. Now it was Harry's turn to speak. Oh, it's actually, Harry began, avoiding the eyes of Sirius and Professor Blaine. He faltered. We're here to ask you something, Professor Blaine. Uh-huh. Atticus Blaine leaned back in his chair, making a nasal sound to indicate he was listening. It's about the Defense Against the Dark Arts course, Harry continued. There have always been rumors that the professor in charge of this course is cursed. Quirrell, Gilderoy Lockhart, and Professor Lupin's experiences all seem to prove this. There's only one exception. Harry glanced at Professor Blaine with wide eyes, while Hermione seemed to dismiss the rumors as unfounded, lowering her head to stare at her toes. Atticus appeared momentarily dazed, but Sirius was visibly stunned by Harry's question. He stared deeply at Harry, whose face resembled James, his lips pursed, and a flicker of light in his light gray eyes. Harry felt suffocated by the tense atmosphere and bowed his head in embarrassment, yet he persisted. We want to know how you avoided this misfortune. Harry, Sirius said softly, you don't have to worry about this. I've thought about it. I'm okay. Us temporarily helping Dumbledore. I only have less than half a school year. Even if the rumor is true, I believe it won't be fatal. End of this chapter. Chapter 367. In recent years, among the unsolved mysteries at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, rumors about the curse on the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor have been rampant. Although Dumbledore remains silent on the matter, it is widely believed that there is some truth to the curse. Remarkably, no matter who takes on the role, they manage to hold the position until the end of the school year. Of course, in the case of Remus Lupin, human intervention played a part in his departure, so it cannot be used as a standard for judgment. Outsiders speculate that the curse has a 1-year time limit, exploding after that period. However, Atticus Blaine, who has personally experienced the curse, has his own perspective. He believes the curse acts more like a slow poison. Once you accept the position, it doesn't manifest immediately. Instead, it subtly alters your fortune, accumulating toxins over time. These negative effects occur quietly, in unseen places, and reach a breaking point after a certain threshold. This curse is a testament to Voldemort's mastery of dark magic. In all the years Atticus has spent in the European magical world, he has never encountered a curse so closely aligned with the law of causality. That said, unless you possess a method like Atticus, avoiding the curse's misfortune is challenging. However, it is possible to mitigate its effects to some extent by controlling the time spent in the role. For instance, Sirius, who only plans to assist Dumbledore for a few months, may not escape the curse entirely, but can limit its impact. This is why Atticus did not object to Sirius accepting Dumbledore's offer. If Dumbledore could find 3 or 4 willing candidates each year, the course's reputation might improve. With Professor Blaine's explanation and Sirius's assurances, Harry finally stopped worrying about his godfather's sudden demise. In the following days, 2 topics dominated conversations at Hogwarts. The first was Sirius's teaching ability in the Defense Against the Dark Arts class. Since Harry wasn't in the class, he sought feedback from others, anxious about any negative reports. However, according to Fred and George, Sirius's teaching was engaging and at least on par with Professor Lupin's. The second topic was a conflict within Slytherin. This altercation erupted in the Slytherin common room after dinner on Monday and was reportedly so intense that the head of Slytherin House had to intervene. Due to Slytherin's secretive nature, the other houses received little information. However, following the conflict, Malfoy and his cronies became more arrogant. While classmates Theodore Nott and Blaise Zabini appeared sullen, their bruises indicating they had lost the skirmish. On Wednesday, the weather was as bright as Harry's mood. As golden sunlight streamed through the dormitory's carved window grill, Harry leapt from his four-poster bed, quickly donned his school uniform, and made his way to Ron's bedside. With a playful slap on the bed's edge, he roused his friend from sleep. "Get up, Ron! We can't miss today's class!" Atticus Blaine exclaimed, shaking his friend awake. Ron groaned, sitting up groggily. He yawned, rubbed his sleepy eyes, and watched as Atticus dashed into the bathroom to get ready. It took Ron a moment to understand why Atticus was so enthusiastic. Neville, Seamus, and Dean were also stirring from their beds. "What's going on?" Seamus asked, puzzled. "I've never seen Atticus so excited about a class." "Sirius's class," Ron replied with a shrug. "He's really looking forward to it." Atticus wasn't the only one eager for Professor Black's lesson. During breakfast in the Great Hall, Hermione overheard her roommates, Lavender and Parvati, giggling and pointing at Professor Black at the staff table. It was undeniable that Sirius was one of the more attractive professors. His handsome features, coupled with a hint of melancholy in his eyes, perhaps a result of past hardships, made him particularly appealing to the young witches who were captivated by romantic notions. While Sirius might not match Professor Blaine's strong teaching style, his charm certainly garnered him a fair share of admirers among the students. As they entered the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom, Sirius, clad in a sky-blue wizard robe, was already leaning against the podium, waiting for the students to settle in. This was a joint class with Slytherin, where Sirius was not as well received as he was in Gryffindor. The Slytherin students sauntered in slowly, with Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle arriving just before the bell rang. Harry shot Malfoy an angry glare, knowing full well that his tardiness was a deliberate attempt to undermine Sirius. Sirius, who shared Harry's disdain for Slytherin, chose to maintain his composure for Atticus' sake. "Let's begin," Sirius announced, smiling as he completed the roll call. "I've reviewed the course progress with Professor Remus Lupin, and I must say I'm pleased with how far you've come." Malfoy sneered, making a derisive noise that echoed through the classroom. "If you cause any trouble, Malfoy," Harry warned, his face flushed with anger, "you'll regret it." "I bet, Potter," Malfoy retorted with a smirk, "you're thrilled to have a godfather with such a rich prison experience." Before Harry could react, Sirius was at his side, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. He fixed Malfoy with a cold stare. 20 points from Slytherin. Do I need to explain why, Malfoy? Challenging a professor was beyond the courage of a third-year student, and despite his disdain, Malfoy didn't dare to respond under Sirius's icy gaze. "This is the moment I've been waiting for," Ron whispered, stifling a laugh under Hermione's disapproving look. "I hope Malfoy shows some backbone." Sirius returned to the podium, scanning the class with a smile. "According to our syllabus, we should be learning about werewolves. However, thanks to Professor Blaine, we have a unique opportunity to explore how to handle an attack from another creature." Atticus Blaine stood at the edge of the bustling marketplace, the vibrant colors of the stalls creating a kaleidoscope of sights and sounds around him. The air was thick with the aroma of spices and freshly baked bread, mingling with the chatter of merchants and customers haggling over prices. He adjusted his worn leather satchel, feeling the reassuring weight of his notebook inside. It was his constant companion, filled with sketches and observations from his travels. Atticus had always been a keen observer of life, finding inspiration in the smallest details that others might overlook. As he wandered through the market, his eyes were drawn to a stall adorned with intricate tapestries. The rich, woven patterns told stories of distant lands and ancient traditions. Atticus paused, running his fingers lightly over the fabric, feeling the texture beneath his fingertips. Each thread seemed to whisper secrets of its origin, and he couldn't help but imagine the hands that had crafted such beauty. Lost in thought, Atticus was brought back to the present by the sound of laughter. A group of children darted past him, their carefree joy infectious. He smiled, reminded of the simple pleasures that life offered amidst its complexities. Continuing his stroll, Atticus found himself at a small cafe, tucked away in a quiet corner of the market. The inviting aroma of freshly brewed coffee beckoned him inside. He settled at a table by the window, where he could watch the world go by while savoring the rich, dark brew. As he sipped his coffee, Atticus reflected on the day's encounters. Each person he met, each story he heard, added another layer to the tapestry of his own life. He knew that his journey was far from over, and the world still held countless mysteries waiting to be discovered. With renewed determination, Atticus Blaine picked up his pen and opened his notebook, ready to capture the essence of the day in words and sketches. The marketplace, with all its vibrancy and life, had once again ignited his passion for exploration and storytelling. Chapter 368. Sirius approached a shelf on the side of the classroom where a cloth-covered object resembling a bird cage was placed. As the students entered, they noticed the cage but heard no sounds coming from it. With a smile, Sirius lifted the cloth, revealing the contents to the class. "Who can tell me the name of this creature? Of course, it's fine if you don't know. Strictly speaking, this creature isn't part of the Defense Against the Dark Arts syllabus." Inside the cage was a large bird with vibrant feathers and an unusual beak. It appeared to be crying, yet no sound could be heard. "Oh, it's a wicked bird," Hermione exclaimed. Her interest piqued as she craned her neck for a better view. "Very good. 5 points to Gryffindor." Sirius nodded approvingly at Hermione. Folding his arms, he added, "Share all you know, Hermione, and you might earn Gryffindor another 5 points. Blushing, Hermione took a deep breath, stood up, and began, "This creature is mostly found in Africa. Wizards adore it for its stunning feathers, which are often used to make expensive quills. The young mandrake can cause fainting and strange screams, and the song of the wicked bird has a similar effect, causing people to lose their minds. The eccentric Uric once tried to prove that the bird's song was beneficial to health by listening to it non-stop for 3 months. He reported his findings to the Wizarding Council, but they were skeptical. He attended the meeting wearing nothing but a small wig, which, upon closer inspection, turned out to be a dead badger. Neville gazed admiringly at Hermione, while Ron muttered, "If it's not in the syllabus, how does she know all this weird stuff?" The Gryffindor students were once again awed by Hermione's knowledge, while the Slytherins mostly responded with sarcasm. Pansy Parkinson mimicked Hermione's tone, amusing Draco. "You think that's funny, do you?" Hermione's face flushed with embarrassment as she pursed her lips. Sirius strode over, his demeanor suggesting he might toss Malfoy and Parkinson out of the classroom. "Is that how you cover up your jealousy, Malfoy Parkinson? Did she steal the limelight from you two?" Dean looked at Sirius with admiration and joked to Harry and Ron, who had already drawn their wands. Malfoy realized that Sirius was not the weak and deceitful character he had assumed, unlike Remus Lupin. If he didn't restrain himself, he might face a month of detention. This realization frustrated him further, feeling humiliated by a criminal who had spent 12 years in Azkaban, a disgrace to the pureblood family who had joined Gryffindor, now reprimanding him as a professor. "Everyone will lose 10 points, Sirius declared sternly. "If you can't keep quiet in my class, I'll keep deducting points from Slytherin until Snape can't find another point in Slytherin's hourglass, and then I'll give you detention." The Gryffindor students were thrilled, their hearts soaring with delight as they glanced at the Slytherins, whose faces were now ashen. "That's the spirit," Ron exclaimed, clenching his fist in triumph. "I've been waiting for this day since I entered Hogwarts." "For once, I hope Malfoy shows some backbone," Harry added with a smirk. Hermione gave Atticus Blaine a stern look. From her perspective, a qualified professor should maintain a certain level of impartiality and not blatantly favor students from a particular house. Most professors managed this well, with Professor McGonagall being a prime example. However, Hermione couldn't help but feel a slight satisfaction at being favored. In previous potions classes, whenever Snape singled out Harry as an example, Malfoy would mock Harry's supposed incompetence. But when it was Malfoy's turn, he realized that confronting a professor with a strong personality wasn't so easy. Sirius snorted disdainfully, then turned back to Hermione. "It's great to be back, Hermione," he said with a smile. "So, can you tell us where you found this?" Mr. Newt Scamander's second revised edition of Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find the Quair Mime includes a story about his travels to Africa. It mentions a creature similar to the witchbird, Hermione replied promptly. When Professor Binns taught us about the history of magic in the Middle Ages, he also mentioned stories about Uruk the Oddball and Merrick the Malicious. "Oh, that's amazing," Sirius exclaimed, clapping his hands in admiration. "Professor Binns's history of magic. I never thought of it. I bet, Hermione, you're probably one of the few students who can stay awake in his class." "Actually," Ron muttered, "the only one." Sirius glanced at Ron with amusement and announced, "Gryffindor earns an undisputed 10 points. Oh, Hermione, I really think you should take this class. You'll learn how to handle such fascinating creatures." Sirius's defense against the dark arts class was a haven for the young Gryffindor wizards. Even Neville, who was often singled out as a failure in other classes, found the courage to answer a few questions. Malfoy, however, was not so fortunate. He attempted to secretly remove Harry's earmuffs while Harry was dealing with the Witchbird and ended up petrified by Sirius for most of the class. "Just carry him out!" Sirius barked when the bell rang, glaring at Crabbe and Goyle as they tried to rouse Draco. "Take him to Snape. If you dare cause trouble in my class, I want to see what Snape has to say." With that, he raised his eyebrows at Harry and the others and strode out of the classroom. "Sirius is so impulsive, and it's only his first week teaching," Hermione said anxiously. "Snape won't let this slide. Harry, we need to find a way to prevent a conflict with Snape." "Are you crazy, Hermione?" Ron exclaimed. "Harry can't let Snape see Sirius as a threat, can he?" "Compared to Snape's attitude towards Gryffindors in Potions class, Sirius is already gentle enough," Harry agreed. "That's not the same thing, Harry," Hermione insisted. Gryffindor had Transfiguration with Hufflepuff that morning, and they couldn't afford to miss Professor McGonagall's class just to watch Malfoy. As they hurried along, Hermione added, "You haven't forgotten the trouble the Hippogriff caused Hagrid. If Malfoy's father finds out how Sirius treated Malfoy, he won't let it go." "But Lucius Malfoy can't touch Sirius," Ron countered. "The Ministry of Magic has declared Sirius innocent, and those officials won't make themselves a laughingstock over a few galleons." Hermione's concerns made Harry uneasy, especially since he hadn't seen Malfoy since the incident. At the Slytherin table during lunch, both Sirius and Snape were absent from the staff table, and Professor Atticus Blaine was missing from his usual seat as well. Suddenly, a peculiar noise echoed through the foyer, drawing the attention of the young wizards, who hurried over to investigate. To their surprise, they found Filch sprawled at the bottom of the stairs, having taken a tumble. Many of the students failed to grasp the gravity of the situation and were instead amused by Filch's misfortune. However, Harry felt an unsettling premonition, sensing that something significant was unfolding. Filch's face was as pale and ghastly as it had been over a year ago when he discovered Mrs. Norris petrified by the basilisk. "They're fighting!" Filch exclaimed, struggling to his feet. He paid no mind to his disheveled appearance as he shouted towards Dumbledore, who was already focused on the commotion at the entrance of the Great Hall. "Professor Black and Professor Snape." End of this chapter. Chapter 369. When Filch shouted that sentence in a slightly desperate tone, the bustling auditorium fell silent almost instantly. Filch had likely never experienced such attention in his life. Hundreds of young wizards fixed their eyes on him, and even the professors at the staff table stared at him in disbelief. I thought you would have foreseen this, Headmaster," Filch stammered, his cheeks flushed. Such a scene was rare in the auditorium. When Filch spoke again, his voice seemed to cast a spell, restoring the noise in the vast hall to a level 10 times louder than before. The young wizards stood up one after another, the clatter of tables and chairs echoing as if someone intended to dismantle the place. "I told you, Harry." Hermione's excited voice was barely noticeable amidst the commotion as she shouted at Harry, "This is just great!" "He actually did that." Ron's expression of shock and bewilderment was quite amusing, even among the astonished young wizards. He opened his mouth, speaking absently. Ron's words jolted Harry into action. He jumped up, ignoring Hermione's frustration, and was about to dash upstairs when boom, like a bomb exploding, a tremendous roar suddenly filled the auditorium, freezing everyone in place. "I hope you can continue to enjoy lunch quietly in the auditorium. Of course, I don't object to students who have already eaten their fill, returning to the lounge for a full rest before the pleasant afternoon classes begin. As for the troublesome students upstairs, I want you to have full confidence that I can handle it," Dumbledore announced, rising from his chair. Though his words were not harsh, his tone was commanding. The young wizards rarely heard their usually amiable headmaster speak to them in such a manner. "Thank you for your support," Dumbledore said, nodding to the young wizards once he confirmed the situation was under control. He then turned to Professor McGonagall, who appeared slightly panicked, with a calm expression, as if the two portraits upstairs were merely bickering. "Could you please maintain order here, Minerva? I'm afraid I'll have to go upstairs and see." "Oh, go upstairs, yes, Albus!" Professor McGonagall grabbed Dumbledore, who was about to leave the hall, worry flickering in her eyes. "Surely you've got the situation under control, Albus?" "Ah, of course," Dumbledore replied with a smile. "I'll be back later to enjoy my pudding, and I apologize to our elf friends who worked so hard to prepare our meal for any waste." Dumbledore's sleeve slipped from Professor McGonagall's grasp, and all eyes followed him as he left the hall. His old, yet now joyless face was a stark contrast to his usual demeanor. As Dumbledore walked out, he glanced at Harry, his gaze like a cold splash of water, calming Harry's racing thoughts. Harry understood that Dumbledore's eyes were a warning, cautioning him not to complicate matters further. Under the guidance of Professor McGonagall, Professor Flitwick, and Professor Sprout, the young wizards reluctantly returned to their seats, but the atmosphere in the auditorium was as heavy as lead. Since the founding of Hogwarts, never had there been an incident of two professors fighting within the school. "Why won't he let me go up?" Harry fumed, more frustrated with Dumbledore than ever. At times like these, Sirius needed support the most, yet Dumbledore wouldn't allow him to go upstairs. "We all know that Sirius and Professor Snape don't get along, and their grievances have a long history," Hermione said calmly. "Dumbledore knows very well that you would only escalate their conflict." Harry understood Hermione's reasoning. He knew that the fight between Sirius and Snape would... It ricocheted harmlessly off the walls. The tension in the corridor was palpable, with the air crackling from the residual magic. Atticus Blaine, still leaning against the stone wall, took another bite of his sandwich, seemingly unfazed by the chaos unfolding before him. The students and staff who had gathered watched with bated breath, their eyes darting between the dueling wizards and Dumbledore, who stood as a calm yet commanding presence amidst the turmoil. His gaze was steady, assessing the situation with a mixture of concern and authority. "Atticus," Dumbledore began, his voice carrying a weight of expectation, "I understand your point, but allowing such conflicts to escalate can lead to unintended consequences." Atticus chuckled softly, his eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief. "Headmaster, sometimes a little skirmish is necessary to clear the air. Besides, with me here, there's no real danger." Madame Pomfrey, still flustered, shook her head in exasperation. "You may find it entertaining, Atticus, but this is a hospital, not a dueling arena." Atticus nodded, acknowledging her concern. "Of course, Madame Pomfrey. I assure you, no harm will come to your patients." Meanwhile, Sirius and Snape continued their exchange, each spell more precise and calculated than the last. The corridor echoed with the sounds of their magical duel, a testament to their long-standing rivalry. "Enough!" Dumbledore's voice cut through the air like a knife, commanding immediate attention. The dueling wizards paused, their wands still raised, but their focus now on the headmaster. "This is neither the time nor the place for such disputes," Dumbledore continued, his tone firm, yet understanding. "We must remember our responsibilities and the example we set for the students." Sirius lowered his wand, a begrudging respect in his eyes. "You're right, Headmaster. My apologies." Snape, ever the stoic, gave a curt nod, his expression unreadable. "Agreed." With the tension diffused, Dumbledore turned to Atticus, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Perhaps next time, Atticus, you might consider intervening a bit sooner." Atticus grinned, finishing his sandwich. "I'll keep that in mind, Headmaster." As the crowd began to disperse, the atmosphere shifted from one of conflict to a more subdued calm. Atticus watched them go, his mind already turning to the tasks that awaited him. Despite the morning's excitement, he knew there was much work to be done, and he was eager to get back to it. Immediately, Atticus Blaine waved his magic wand, releasing a thick black mist that descended upon the ground. As the mist enveloped the scattered stones, they began to transform into venomous snakes, each as thick as a wrist. Hundreds of these black serpents slithered across the corridor's floor, walls, and ceiling, their forked tongues flickering as they hissed menacingly at Sirius. "You've come a long way, Pug," Snape sneered, standing amidst the writhing mass of pythons. His grin was grim and mocking. I mean, blunt and self-righteous. End of this chapter. Chapter 370, Halt the Duel. "You think this will scare me?" Atticus Blaine stood unfazed, facing the writhing mass of venomous snakes. His voice dripped with disdain. "Your magic is as repulsive as you are, snotling! I hope you maintain that bravado, Pug." Snape's dark eyes gleamed with an unsettling fervor. With a swift motion, he brandished his wand, and the serpents began to slither menacingly, encircling Atticus from all sides. The scene was terrifying. Madame Pomfrey let out an involuntary scream, while the young wizards nearby, including Draco, turned ashen, their bodies trembling uncontrollably. Suddenly, a fierce, blazing flame erupted in the narrow corridor, emanating from the tip of Atticus's staff. Though not fiend fire, it was a formidable magical fire. The purple flames engulfed Snape's serpents, causing them to writhe and hiss in agony. Yet, the flames couldn't completely halt their advance. Under Snape's command, the snakes quickly adapted, dozens intertwined, rolling through the fiery barrier. The outer serpents were scorched, but those within remained unscathed. With a swift, menacing hiss, the surviving snakes launched themselves like springs, fangs bared, aiming directly for Atticus's face. "Protego!" Atticus shouted, retreating a few steps. He had to withdraw the flames to focus on conjuring a protective barrier with his wand. Snape, a skilled duelist, seized the opportunity. His eyes burned with intensity as he flicked his wrist. The shattered glass from the school hospital's door glinted ominously before hurtling towards the back of Atticus's neck with a sharp whistle. Boom! A thunderous roar echoed through the fourth floor, reverberating like a storm. The glass shards disintegrated into fine dust, and the remaining serpents burst into black smoke. Simultaneously, the magical barrier before Atticus shattered with a sharp crack. Both Atticus and Snape turned pale, overwhelmed by a wave of dizziness that brought them to their knees, retching. At the sound of the thunder, Draco's mind went blank, as if an irresistible force had wiped his consciousness clean. When he finally regained his senses, a lingering shock gripped his heart, making it hard to breathe. Glancing around, Draco noticed Madame Pomfrey and the others, similarly affected. Only Dumbledore seemed untouched, his silver beard gently swaying in the breeze, eyes half-closed behind his half-moon spectacles. "The sparring between old friends requires caution," Atticus remarked, lowering his wand with a dissatisfied click of his tongue. Both Atticus and Snape, now on their feet, shot furious glares at Atticus, especially Snape, who had been so close to achieving his lifelong wish. The rare opportunity had been thwarted by Atticus's intervention. "I believe you owe us an explanation for your actions," Snape demanded, his voice laced with frustration. Dumbledore emerged from behind Atticus Blaine, observing the two impulsive, middle-aged men with a calm yet icy demeanor. "This is indeed too much," he remarked, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. Although Dumbledore understood that Snape and Sirius would not have engaged in a confrontation outside the school hospital without Atticus's intervention to maintain order, their behavior was still unacceptable. "It's time to question your new professor, Headmaster Dumbledore," Snape declared, his chin raised defiantly. "He brazenly used spells to attack an exemplary Slytherin student during class. I suspect that 12 years in prison have not purged the inherent malevolence from his character." "Oh, malevolence. That's amusing, snot-nosed," Sirius retorted, slightly out of breath. His fatigue seemed more pronounced than Snape's, which was unsurprising. While their skills might have been comparable in their youth, Sirius had endured years of torment by Dementors in Azkaban, whereas Snape had honed his abilities at Hogwarts. "Need I remind you of the pranks you pulled while serving under Voldemort?" Sirius continued. "Sirius," Dumbledore interjected, his voice deep and authoritative. The mere mention of Voldemort's name still struck fear into the hearts of many, as evidenced by the panic on Madame Pomfrey's face and the young wizards nearby. "Severus has distanced himself from that past, and I am confident his allegiance will not falter again." "That's your opinion, Headmaster Dumbledore," Sirius replied coldly, his gaze fixed on Snape, who wore an equally displeased expression. I don't believe he's fully reformed. At the very least, you need to explain, Dumbledore said, his sharp eyes peering at Sirius through his half-moon spectacles. Severus mentioned that you used magic to discipline a student in class. I trust Minerva has shown you the teacher's regulations, and you are aware that such punishments are prohibited? Then you should ask that Malfoy boy what he did in class, Sirius said, casting a disdainful glance at Draco. He attempted to remove Harry's earmuffs while I was instructing him on handling the wicked birds. You all know the consequences of that. Speaking of which, Sirius added, glaring at Snape, I've heard from multiple sources about how you treat Harry in potions class. Consider this a warning, Snape. If I hear of such incidents again, I will confront you. What a touching father-son relationship, Snape sneered. Surely you've noticed how much Potter resembles his father? Indeed, Sirius replied proudly. Then you must also recognize that he shares his father's arrogance and self-righteousness, turning a deaf ear to criticism. Oh, and let's not forget his lack of gratitude, Snape added with a smirk. Sirius raised his wand once more, but Dumbledore's voice cut through the tension, now much firmer. I do not wish to confiscate your wand, Sirius, but if you persist in this behavior in my presence, I will have no choice. In the corridor outside the school hospital, Snape and Sirius glared at each other, their mutual disdain palpable. Even Dumbledore found it challenging to mediate their deep-seated animosity. All right, Atticus clapped his hands cheerfully. The grievance is settled. Draco glanced at Professor Blaine, marveling at his ability to feign resolution when it was clear that both Snape and the new irksome professor were eager to tear each other apart. Nevertheless, with Dumbledore's arrival, the duel could not continue. Snape sneered, turned on his heel, and strode away down the corridor, while Sirius, his expression still stormy, muttered, If I hear of Snape harassing Harry in potions class again, Dumbledore. His words trailed off as he leaped past Atticus and Dumbledore, departing in the opposite direction. Atticus Blaine's figure vanished into the shadows beneath the stairs, his slightly muffled voice echoing, It is my responsibility. Dumbledore's half-closed eyes reflected a sense of helplessness, while Atticus shook his head with a knowing smile. Sirius had been provoked by their initial encounter, and both Godfather and Godson were eager to express their concern for one another, albeit a bit too hastily. What should I do now? Madame Pomfrey demanded, her voice tinged with frustration as she surveyed the school hospital, where nearly half of the front hall lay in ruins. If Hogwarts doesn't need a hospital, Dumbledore, I can hand in my resignation right now. The young wizards can't do without you, Poppy, Dumbledore replied gently. Don't worry about it. I can help you clean up. With that, he stepped into the debris, waved his wand, and the destruction was reversed, as if time itself had been rewound. You don't have to worry, Draco, Atticus reassured Malfoy, who stood silently. The young boy had realized that his disruptive behavior in the Defense Against the Dark Arts class had sparked the conflict between the two professors. Now, he was frightened by the gravity of the situation. No one will punish you for this, Atticus said with a comforting smile. Yet, Draco's face remained ashen, his lips pale as if drained of color. He nodded tensely in response to Professor Blaine's reassurance. As Dumbledore continued to repair the dust-laden school hospital, Atticus decided not to linger and assist Sirius and Professor Snape with the cleanup. Come on, Draco, come with me to the office. I happen to need your help with something, he said, leading the way. End of this chapter. Chapter 371, Physical Education Class? That afternoon, none of the young wizards could focus on their lessons. The entire school buzzed with talk of the unprecedented duel between professors at Hogwarts. As rumors swirled, the students gradually pieced together the truth of the event. It came as no surprise to anyone that Atticus Blaine had subdued both Professor Snape and Professor Black with a single spell. Since his arrival at Hogwarts, Professor Blaine had performed numerous astonishing feats, and the students had grown accustomed to his extraordinary abilities. In their minds, Professor Blaine's image was beginning to rival that of Dumbledore himself, and in some houses, whispers suggested he had even surpassed their headmaster. The real intrigue lay in the outcome of the duel between Professor Black and Professor Snape. Opinions were sharply divided. Those who had witnessed the duel firsthand shared the details, but their limited understanding led to varied interpretations of the result. Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw students managed to maintain a relatively neutral stance, while Slytherin staunchly believed their head of house had emerged victorious. Conversely, no Gryffindor could accept the notion that Professor Black had lost the intense duel. By the end of the afternoon, the school's atmosphere had grown inexplicably tense. Whether in class or around the grounds, Slytherin and Gryffindor students exchanged hostile glares whenever they crossed paths. The tension escalated to such a degree that Dumbledore had to assign professors to patrol the castle, ensuring peace was maintained. None of the duel's participants were seen for the rest of the day. Both Sirius and Snape had arranged for colleagues to cover their classes, and Professor Blaine remained secluded in his office. Even Malfoy was absent until nightfall. As dinner commenced, the Great Hall's ceiling displayed a brilliant galaxy of stars, yet the missing professors were nowhere to be found. Harry, still fuming, turned his gaze away from Hufflepuff's Ernie Macmillan, who had been animatedly sharing his own interpretation of the duel's outcome, an interpretation Harry found unacceptable. Sirius would never lose to Snape, Harry declared with conviction, earning nods of agreement from those around him. Yet, curiously, neither Ron nor Hermione voiced their opinions. When Harry looked at them, Hermione cautiously suggested, "Why don't you ask Sirius, Harry? He wouldn't hide the truth from you." Earlier, after classes had ended, Ron had proposed they seek out Sirius for answers, but Harry had declined. "I'm trying not to bother him right now, Ron," Harry explained. "He's just taken over Professor Lupin's duties and has a lot on his plate. I don't want to add to his burdens." Though Harry stood firm in his refusal, this wasn't his true reason. With several professors absent, the staff table appeared half empty. Dumbledore was deep in conversation with the heads of 3 houses. Hagrid, noticing the concern in Harry's eyes, offered him a reassuring nod. Just then, Malfoy, who had been missing for most of the day, made a sudden appearance. He seemed elated, as if he had stumbled upon something worth celebrating. Harry, Ron, and Hermione exchanged wary glances, sensing that whatever pleased Malfoy was unlikely to bode well for them. Oddly, Malfoy was accompanied by Filch. Instead of heading straight to the Great Hall for dinner, he assisted Filch in posting notices on the foyer's bulletin board. It was well known that Malfoy's family held a significant influence at Hogwarts, and this unexpected collaboration only deepened the mystery. Draco Malfoy, a staunch advocate of the pure-blood ideology, often looked down on wizards who weren't pure-blooded. In the first half of their second year, he even went so far as to call Hermione a mudblood. Filch, known to almost everyone as a squib, was not well liked among the students. The young wizards of Slytherin House, who roamed the castle daily, never received a warm reception from Filch. It was surprising then to see Malfoy, their representative, assisting Filch with his duties. This unexpected behavior left many puzzled. "I bet that old Git Filch has come up with some useless rules," Fred said with a contemptuous grin. He glanced at his brother, George, and saw the same mischievous glint in his eyes. "Maybe we should give him a little more power and see what happens," George agreed. "You two better stay calm," Hermione warned, her eyes fixed on Malfoy as he strutted back to the Slytherin table, beaming and chatting animatedly with his peers. Filch is now under the jurisdiction of the Student Safety Office, which means any of his decisions are approved by Professor Blaine. If you don't mind crossing Professor Blaine, go ahead with your pranks. "Why don't we go and have a look?" Harry suggested suddenly. At the Ravenclaw table, Cho Chang and a reddish-blonde, curly-haired man walked arm in arm toward the notice board. At the long Hufflepuff table, their Quidditch team captain, Cedric Diggory, who had bested Harry in a match last year, stood up and caught up with Cho, greeting her as they headed toward the notice board together. Hermione noticed Harry's unusual expression and raised her delicate eyebrows. "All right, we can go and see for ourselves." Their movement acted as a signal, and soon the sound of tables, chairs, and benches scraping echoed throughout the Great Hall. Many young wizards from the 4 long tables couldn't contain their curiosity and rushed to the hall. The spacious area quickly became crowded, and those at the front were pressed tightly together. Harry could smell the fresh scent of Cho's hair, so close to him. His heart raced, even more than when he was about to catch the golden snitch in a Quidditch match. This feeling both fascinated and confused him until he realized Cho Chang was looking at him with a curious expression, snapping him back to reality. "Oh, what?" Harry stammered, realizing Cho was speaking to him, though he hadn't heard a word. He asked, embarrassed. "Oh," Cho said, pursing her lips. She struggled against the young wizards pushing forward, her arms inadvertently pressed against Harry's chest. She smiled apologetically. "I was asking about Professor Black, your godfather. How is he? Everyone's talking about his duel with Professor Snape." Harry was unsure about Sirius's current situation. He opened his mouth to respond, but Cedric, who had overheard, interjected, "I don't think Professor Black will lose to Snape. He's a hero, isn't he? Even the Dementors in Azkaban couldn't defeat him." Harry felt uneasy with Cedric's sudden comment, but nodded in agreement. "I agree with you. I don't think anything can beat him." Cho seemed more familiar and comfortable with Cedric, chatting animatedly about the recent Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff match, which Ravenclaw had won. Contrary to Fred's earlier remark, Cedric wasn't too dumb for sentences. In fact, he was quite adept at compliments, and soon Cho's attention drifted away from Harry. If Harry had felt like he was floating on clouds moments ago, he now felt as if he had been plunged into a cold abyss. His vision blurred, and the text on the announcement board seemed to evade his gaze. He couldn't make out a single word. Hermione stood right behind them, clearly in a daze, having witnessed everything. She had seen Harry's defeat unfold effortlessly and could only sigh in response. "Oh, Professor Blaine plans to introduce a physical education class to train young wizards," she remarked. "The physical fitness program will begin with the 3rd and 4th grades. If students from other grades are interested, they can apply through the Student Safety Office, provided they have the dean's approval." Ron, taken aback, exclaimed, "Sports? Physical fitness? What strange words." Just then, he winced as Hermione, who was half a head shorter than him, stepped heavily on his instep. She glared at him angrily. "Why are you stepping on me?" he protested. End of this chapter. Chapter 372, Attention. At 9 o'clock in the evening, most would be preparing for bed, but tonight the Gryffindor common room was still brightly lit. Sleepless young wizards were scattered everywhere, eagerly discussing the new physical fitness class that Professor Blaine was set to introduce at Hogwarts. Even the Gryffindor prefect had forgotten to remind everyone to maintain order, joining in the lively conversation instead. In the wizarding world, especially at Hogwarts, native-born wizards like Ron often found themselves at the center of attention during such discussions. Their deep-rooted understanding of magic far surpassed that of students like Harry, who had grown up in the Muggle world. Of course, there were exceptions, like Hermione, who was a freak in the best possible way. However, this time, the tables had turned. Wizards born into magical families were now gathering around Harry, Hermione, Dean, and Seamus, eager to hear their tales of physical education. Amidst the buzzing chatter, the portrait of the fat lady swung open, and Percy Weasley, the head boy, climbed through the entrance. He frowned instinctively at the commotion in the lounge, ready to reprimand the students. Yet, considering the special circumstances and his own breach of school rules, he swallowed his words. "Don't block the door, Mr. Chairman." Fred and George, Percy's twin brothers, clambered into the room, gently nudging Percy aside to make way for Ginny, Colin, and others behind them. "How did it go?" Ron called out from near the fireplace, waving them over. "Easy," George replied, flicking his hair with a carefree air. "It didn't take much effort, did it, Fred?" "Excuse me, make some room," Fred said, pulling Ron up from the sofa to sit down with a sigh of relief. "It took us a while to persuade her to sign the application. Professor McGonagall had no objections to Ginny's application, but she wasn't thrilled about George and me joining. She's worried it might affect our OWL's results, but honestly, who cares about that stuff? Do you, George?" "I don't care," George replied simply. Ginny giggled, while Ron, left standing, glared at her. "Why did you apply, Ginny? You're only in the 2nd grade, and you're a girl." "Do you have something against girls, Ron?" Ginny retorted, though her tone softened when she noticed Harry watching her. A blush crept across her cheeks. "Professor Blaine probably hopes his course will gain more support. He saved me from the Chamber of Secrets, and I should be grateful. Besides, I think this course will be very interesting. Ron couldn't argue with that. Professor Blaine's kindness to the Weasleys was undeniable. Interesting, maybe, Ron muttered under his breath. I joined for the same reason, Percy said solemnly. You have no idea how much I have on my plate. Classes, Newt's preparation, maintaining order, and planning my future. Percy had aspirations of working at the ministry and wasn't shy about sharing his ambitions. I thought it was for your girlfriend, Ginny teased. I overheard her in the foyer. She's very interested in Professor Blaine's courses and plans to ask Professor Flitwick to sign her application. Percy's face turned a deep shade of red, confirming Ginny's playful accusation to everyone. Percy was willing to invest time in what initially seemed like a worthless gym class. If you want to join the ministry, Percy, perhaps you could speak with Professor Blaine, Hermione suggested. Known for her academic prowess, Hermione had always maintained a good relationship with Percy. Among the Weasley siblings, aside from Ron, she got along best with him. She had sought Percy's advice numerous times, and during their conversations, Percy often shared his aspirations of joining the Ministry of Magic. Although Mr. Weasley worked at the ministry, he couldn't match Professor Blaine's high-level connections. Hermione was certain of this, as Mr. Weasley couldn't have easily resolved her issue with the time-turner. Oh, you're right, Hermione, Percy responded immediately. Dad mentioned in his letter that Professor Blaine is quite close to the minister and Miss Amelia Bones from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Perhaps he could write me a letter of recommendation for a position in that department. It's the most powerful department in the Ministry of Magic. Thank you, Hermione. I'll think about how to persuade Professor Blaine. With that, Percy hurried off, ascending the spiral staircase and disappearing from view. A creature of ambition without emotion, Fred remarked, shaking his head, which prompted everyone to laugh. What were you talking about just now? Ginny inquired. Harry and Seamus were explaining what physical education is like in Muggle schools, Neville said worriedly. I think I might not be very good at it. Don't worry, Neville, Dean reassured him thoughtfully. It's not the only subject you're not good at. But honestly, it sounds ridiculous, Ron said, frowning in confusion. Harry just described some of the sports he played in Muggle school. No broomsticks, no bats, just people running around chasing a ball that doesn't fly, or lifting an iron ball to throw it as far as possible. I can't understand why Muggles enjoy these sports, and now Professor Blaine wants to teach us these in physical education class? Football isn't as thrilling as Quidditch, but it's still fun, Harry said. And that many Muggles around the world enjoy the game, and we all know Professor Blaine likes to surprise us. But the class name comes from Muggles, doesn't it? Yet Hogwarts is a school of wizardry, Ron said, crossing his arms and frowning. Maybe, Hermione offered the most plausible explanation so far. Professor Blaine might want us to learn more about Muggles through their sports. Unlike Mr. Weasley, many wizards don't care about changes in the Muggle world, but Muggles are quite remarkable. They use technology to overcome many challenges. Professor Dumbledore often tells us to acknowledge Muggle progress, but with little success. Perhaps Professor Blaine is trying to bridge the gap between the two worlds this way. Hermione's reasoning made sense, but Hogwarts already had a Muggle studies class, so there was no need for Professor Blaine to encroach on Professor Caredy Bubbagee's domain. Meanwhile, Professor Black and Professor Snape returned to the faculty dining table, appearing fine and ignoring each other as usual, much to the disappointment of the students hoping for more drama. As for Professor Blaine's upcoming physical education class, it generated considerable excitement over the next few days. Although the announcement stated that only third- and fourth-year students were required to participate, a few senior students from the four houses showed interest as well. Schools that applied to participate were eagerly awaiting the start of the program. The deans of the college welcomed applications from young wizards, and in most cases, they approved them. However, they cautioned the applicants that the course could be challenging, urging them to be mentally prepared for the demands ahead. After a tense weekend filled with anticipation, Monday morning finally arrived. Under the bright spotlight, Professor Atticus Blaine's much-anticipated physical education class commenced, marking the beginning of an exciting new chapter. End of this chapter. Chapter 3 Run, ladies and gentlemen. In the early morning, before the first light of dawn, a faint green halo lingered at the horizon where the sky met the earth. The black lake shimmered under the dim light, and the rolling grasslands stretched endlessly. A gentle breeze, though not harsh, swept across Atticus Blaine's neck, causing him to shiver and raising goosebumps on his arms. He stomped his slightly numb feet and turned to see Hermione's eyelashes glistening with dew. Instinctively, he touched his own head and found his hair damp as well. On the Quidditch pitch, beneath the towering goalposts that reached into the darkness, about 100 young wizards huddled together, shivering in the cold wind. This group included all the 3rd and 4th year students from the 4 houses, along with 20 or 30 senior students from the 5th year and above, and a handful of 2nd year students. Atticus glanced at the students, each dressed in a variety of casual clothes, and felt a sudden urge to laugh. A few days earlier, after finalizing the list of students who had chosen this course, Professor Blaine had asked a 2nd-year Ravenclaw witch to post a new announcement. It required all students to arrive at the playground early and to wear comfortable clothing suitable for movement. Typically, except on weekends, students were expected to wear their school uniforms, styled as wizard robes, during school hours. Seeing over 100 students in casual attire at Hogwarts was a rare sight. The faint light in the sky offered little warmth, and the young wizards shivered in the cold wind. Few had the energy to chat, including Atticus. Percy's girlfriend was dozing in his arms, Ginny leaned on Hermione's shoulder, and Ron sat cross-legged on the grass, snoring softly. Most of the students were in a similar state, and Atticus thought that if Professor Blaine's physical education class continued to wake them up like this, Fred and George's prank products for skipping classes might become quite useful. After another 10 minutes, about half of the students were sprawled on the ground, while most of the others staggered about, barely awake. Only the Ravenclaw student who had posted the notice for Professor Blaine remained alert, staring blankly at the misty black lake. Atticus noticed something around her neck, resembling a metal necklace as it glinted in the faint morning light. With nothing else to do, he found himself staring at the necklace, trying to discern what it was. Suddenly, the Ravenclaw girl turned around, and her silver eyes shone brightly in the dim sky. "Oh, sorry." Atticus quickly realized his rudeness and apologized, but a voice behind him made him understand that she wasn't looking at him. "I warned you about." A familiar voice, laced with humor, carried on the breeze, jolting the sleepy students to their feet. "Go to bed early. My class doesn't give you time to doze off." It was Professor Blaine. He had shed his wizard robes for a smart Muggle-style tracksuit and appeared as energetic as ever, seemingly unaffected by the early hour. None of the students responded to Professor Blaine's joke. They hung their heads, still groggy. Perhaps the only ones who seemed unfazed were Fred and George, who were accustomed to late-night escapades followed by early morning classes. "What do we need to do, Professor?" Fred asked, staring intently. Atticus Blaine stood with his back straight, observing Professor Blaine with great interest. "Throwing metal balls into the Quidditch hoop like Muggles do? Do we need broomsticks?" Fred asked. "Muggles don't have this sport, Fred," Atticus chuckled. He then clapped his hands loudly and raised his voice. "Now, the first thing I need you to do is cheer up and gather around me." When Professor Blaine taught Defense Against the Dark Arts, no young wizard dared to ignore his instructions. However, this time, after a long moment of hesitation, the young wizards slowly gathered around him. Atticus looked at their listless and immature faces and smiled to himself, choosing not to show any displeasure. He understood that these little ones needed time to adjust. As Professor Blaine began to speak, Hermione immediately perked up. She was the only student who had brought a notebook, but Atticus stopped her this time. "You don't need to write down what I say. Just listen, Miss Granger." Glancing at the morning sun that had just risen over the horizon, casting a cross-shaped brilliance, Atticus raised his voice. "Perhaps you're all wondering why I'm starting a new physical education class at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, a class that only appears in Muggle schools, and what I will teach you in this class." This was indeed the question on everyone's mind since Professor Blaine had announced the news. The young wizards, gradually regaining their focus, listened intently to Professor Blaine's words. "But please allow me to say sorry. Today, I will not answer these two questions for you." Atticus's words were met with sighs of disappointment that echoed across the Quidditch field in the cold wind. Hermione immediately raised her hand, and with Professor Blaine's permission, she asked, "But we at least need to know what we're supposed to study. I mean, how else are we going to do our homework?" "There will be no homework for the time being, Miss Granger," Atticus replied with a smile. "At Hogwarts, every professor, except for Quidditch instructors, assigned homework after class." Professor Blaine's statement did not bring joy to the young wizards. Instead, it left them even more puzzled. "First of all, one thing you need to know is," Atticus continued after some discussion, "this sudden physical education class will not interfere with your regular class schedule for now. In fact, during the first stage, you are only required to be here before 6 o'clock every morning." "Every day?" Ron exclaimed in despair. "Including Saturday and Sunday?" 6 o'clock? Lavender Brown, Hermione's roommate from Gryffindor, cried out in dismay. "But only enough sleep can ensure the skin's radiance." "If you value the radiance of your skin more than the desire for self-improvement, Miss Lavender Brown," Professor Blaine said, his smile fading, replaced by a calm expression that exuded an unspeakable authority, "you can return to the warmth of your four-poster bed and continue your sweet dreams." The young wizards fell silent, and Atticus sighed, his tone softening. "What I said was not meant to scare you. In fact, you are allowed to opt out of this physical education class, but the time limit is only 1 month. You can quit at any time during this period, but after a month, you must persevere until the end of the phased course." Hermione frowned, trying to discern Professor Blaine's intentions. Harry glanced at Malfoy, noticing his determined expression, and saw that many young wizards shared the same resolve. He set aside his anxiety and quietly awaited Professor Blaine's next instructions. Ron opened his mouth, hesitant to speak, but seeing neither Harry nor Hermione wavering, he remained silent. Neither Hermione nor Ginny voiced any opinions, though Ginny clenched her fists tightly, as if preparing for a fierce battle. Observing this, Atticus Blaine quickly decided to keep his thoughts to himself. It was no surprise to him that none of the young wizards were willing to give up at this point. However, he wondered how many would still be standing after a month of rigorous training. "Now then," Atticus announced, gesturing to the expansive lawn beneath their feet, "the first task we have ahead of us, which we will undertake without interruption for an entire month, is to run 20 laps around the Quidditch pitch every morning." Seeing the astonished expressions on the faces of the young wizards, Atticus couldn't help but smile. "What are you waiting for? Run, ladies and gentlemen." End of this chapter. Chapter 374, Follow-Up Effects. After the duel between Sirius and Snape, subtle yet significant changes began to ripple through Hogwarts, changes that those with keen insight could foresee. These shifts were most evident among the young wizards of Gryffindor and Slytherin. The two houses, already known for their rivalry, found their tensions escalating. Whether in the Great Hall, the corridors, the courtyards, or the classrooms, the students from these houses barely communicated, each group eyeing the other with suspicion. This wariness was not without cause. Harry had encountered numerous underhanded tricks on his way to and from classes. Although Malfoy had no concrete evidence against him, Harry was certain that one afternoon, Malfoy had hidden behind a staircase corner, tripping him and dumping a load of dung bombs on his head as he fell. Malfoy's actions were clearly irrational, as he seemed to forget that when it came to dung bombs, he was no match for the Weasley twins. In fact, the very dung bombs he used might have been sold to him by Fred and George themselves. One night in mid to late March, after Slytherin's astronomy class with Professor Sinistra, the young wizards descended from the observatory, crossed the inner courtyard, and headed back to the main castle. As they were about to enter the underground passage leading to Slytherin's common room, a tantalizing aroma from the Great Hall caught Crabbe and Goyle's attention. What happened next was inevitable. Filch, drawn by the angry shouts and cries for help, arrived to find the Great Hall reeking of dung bombs. Despite working tirelessly through the night, the air remained tainted with the foul stench. The deans of the 4 houses were furious. They instructed the prefects and student union leaders to increase night patrols and personally questioned the portraits near the Great Hall about any students present that night. However, they found no useful clues. The perpetrator had a keen sense of evasion, leaving no trace behind. "It does surprise me, Headmaster Dumbledore," Snape remarked during a debriefing, his black eyes fixed on Sirius with undisguised suspicion. "Who in this school is adept at evading detection and concealing their whereabouts?" "If you want my opinion, Severus," Dumbledore replied calmly, setting down his silver fork, "Atticus Blaine is quite skilled in such matters." "Speak with your conscience, Headmaster Dumbledore," Atticus interjected, rolling his eyes. "Your own skills in this area are second to none." "Are you accusing me, Snape?" Sirius retorted, meeting Snape's gaze with equal intensity. He refused to tolerate Snape's sarcasm. "I'm not accusing anyone," Snape replied slyly. "I'm merely reminding everyone that a certain beast managed to infiltrate the school unnoticed during last year's Halloween feast." "If you want to know the truth," Sirius said coldly, "I despise that Malfoy kid. He's as cunning as his father, but I haven't stooped to throwing dung bombs on his head." "Please, both of you," Professor McGonagall interjected, glaring at Snape and Sirius. "Could you refrain from arguing during meals? The students are watching you." The brewing argument was quelled by Professor McGonagall's firm intervention. After dinner, before leaving the table, Dumbledore issued a warning, expressing his hope that the ongoing tension within Hogwarts Castle would soon come to an end. "I didn't do anything to the Malfoy kid," Sirius muttered as he left the hall. The office had once belonged to Remus, and as Atticus Blaine ascended to the 3rd floor with him, Sirius wore a solemn expression, yet a triumphant smile played on his lips. "I'm just giving some pointers to the Weasley twins and Harry," Sirius explained. "If you want to avoid getting caught for pranks, you have to be wary of those portraits that love to tattle." "Please, don't involve me in this anymore," Atticus replied, unsurprised by Sirius's involvement. He added with a hint of frustration, "I was the one who figured out how to get rid of Draco, Crabbe, and Goyle, and the small stench of dung and eggs in the Great Hall." Dumbledore must have had a private word with Snape, and under Atticus's persuasion, Sirius had toned down his aggressiveness. Consequently, the tense atmosphere between Slytherin and Gryffindor had eased somewhat. However, the school faced more than just this issue. Atticus's physical education class had also significantly impacted the professor's teaching at Hogwarts. Although he scheduled the exercise sessions for the early morning to avoid interfering with regular classes, the young wizard's stamina was limited. Arriving at the Quidditch pitch before 6 meant they had to rise from their warm, comfortable 4-poster beds before dawn, often skipping breakfast. Now, even in Professor McGonagall's and Snape's classes, students struggled to stay awake, not just in Professor Binns' History of Magic. "Perhaps you could schedule your lessons in the evening, like astronomy, Atticus," Professor McGonagall suggested, her patience wearing thin. She confronted Atticus in his office, exclaiming, "Look at the situation. At least a quarter of Ravenclaw's 4th years dozed off in my class this morning." "Only a quarter, Professor McGonagall?" Atticus replied with a sheepish smile. "That ratio isn't too high, is it?" "That's because only a quarter of Ravenclaw's 4th-year students are still attending your gym class," Professor McGonagall retorted, her face flushed with frustration. Indeed, about a third of the young wizards had dropped out of Atticus's gym class within a week, with Ravenclaw, predominantly girls, showing the most disinterest in the mundane Muggle sport. Atticus wasn't bothered by this. He had anticipated it. The remaining students found the class tiring and dull, but persisted for various reasons. It was estimated that after a month, fewer than 50 students would remain. Neville was probably the only one genuinely enjoying it. "This class is easy," Neville remarked in the common room on Friday night. The atmosphere was subdued, as the students who had persevered knew they would have to rise early again the next morning, robbing the weekend of its restful promise. "I mean, it doesn't require much thinking, which is what I'm afraid of." For the ever-optimistic Neville, the others were at a loss for words. "And," Neville continued, patting his stomach, "when I go home for the summer, I'm sure my grandma will be amazed at how many ways she's thought of to help me lose weight." Neville wasn't trying to entertain everyone, but Ginny expressed her concern. "I ran into Percy in the library today," she said, "and he told me that Penelope decided to drop Professor Blaine's class because she dozed off in Professor Snape's potions class. She couldn't handle the potion splashing from the cauldron in time, and now she has a large scab on her nose, which really upset Percy." "Oh," Hermione frowned. "What is Percy going to do? Is he going to give up?" "I think he'll stick with it," Ginny replied, absent-mindedly twirling her hair. "Of course, he shares our perspective," said the red-haired individual. "We're not Muggle athletes, so why should we exhaust ourselves with all this exercise?" "True," another chimed in, "but you're all aware that he intends to ask Professor Blaine for a letter of recommendation. If he drops this course now, he'll be too embarrassed to approach Professor Blaine again. Besides, he'll be graduating in just a few months." End of this chapter. Chapter 375. Sad Realizations. Friday nights are typically the most relaxing time for young wizards, especially with the anticipation of Hogsmeade being open to Hogwarts students the following day. However, in the common rooms of the various houses, there always seems to be a corner where the atmosphere is heavy with contemplation. Ginny had just finished expressing her thoughts about her brother Percy, leaving the room in a contemplative silence. Anyway, Seamus finally broke the quiet after a long pause, shrugging as he voiced what everyone was thinking. "I've decided to give up, guys. I just don't see the point in this class. I mean, if I want to exercise, there are better ways than starving at dawn and running to the Quidditch pitch to circle aimlessly. In the wizarding world, Quidditch is a beloved sport. If Professor Blaine intended to teach everyone some flying skills, the situation would be different." "I agree," Dean chimed in, raising his hand. "Professor Blaine might have a method for teaching us how to handle dark creatures, but I can't let this class disrupt my school life." Among the group, Hermione was undoubtedly the most affected. She was taking the most courses and spent countless hours each night preparing homework and reading. Professor Blaine's class had significantly disrupted her routine. Harry, Fred, and George were also struggling. As members of the Gryffindor Quidditch team, they couldn't afford to miss their regular training sessions, even with the added physical training twice a week. To be honest, the main reason the Weasley siblings had persevered was out of gratitude for Professor Blaine's kindness. Otherwise, Fred, George, and Ron would have likely quit. Yet, Ginny remained hopeful about the future of the course. "Malfoy's two little minions gave up the next day, and I thought Professor Blaine would lose his temper," Ron grumbled. It was indeed peculiar. No professor would typically allow students to abandon their classes so easily, yet Professor Blaine seemed indifferent to the dwindling numbers, focusing only on those who remained to complete their daily tasks. "What did Sirius say, Harry? Did you ask him for advice?" Hermione inquired cautiously. "No," Harry replied, shaking his head. "I'll ask him when I go to Hogsmeade with him tomorrow." There wasn't much else to discuss that night. Since Professor Blaine had instituted early morning runs, the late-night dormitory chats that had persisted for nearly 3 years had vanished. Everyone went to bed early to avoid stumbling down the moving staircases in a sleepy haze the next morning. The alarm rang promptly at dawn, and Harry swiftly silenced it, taking a deep breath before getting up. He changed out of his pajamas and into one of Dudley's old t-shirts. Most of his Muggle clothes were hand-me-downs from Dudley. During his time with the Dursleys, his uncle and aunt never bothered to provide him with proper clothing, believing that feeding him was a sufficient act of kindness. After entering the wizarding world, Harry discovered that his parents had left him a small fortune, safely stored in a Gringotts vault. While the money was more than enough to cover his 7 years at Hogwarts, it wasn't quite enough to indulge in luxuries like the Muggle sneakers and sportswear he longed for. Today, Atticus Blaine no longer felt the need to attend the monotonous PE class taught by Professor Blaine. Over the past 2 weeks, Harry had grown accustomed to waking up early, unlike the first day when everyone in the dormitory practically crawled downstairs. After dealing with the morning routine in the dormitory bathroom, Harry was fully awake. The day's schedule was leisurely. After exercising and having breakfast, he planned to return to the dormitory for a nap. Before 10 o'clock, he needed to depart for Hogsmeade. Thanks to Sirius, he could now visit openly instead of sneaking through the secret passage behind the hunchbacked witch. Lunch would be in Hogsmeade, followed by shopping. Harry planned to visit the Duke of B candy store to stock up on sweets and Zoko's joke shop to prepare some big dung eggs. Although he didn't particularly like them, Malfoy's last prank convinced him that such gadgets were essential. Hermione would likely want to visit the literary residence, as her quills, ink, and notebooks were always the fastest to run out among the young wizards. These errands would probably consume their entire afternoon. By 5 o'clock, they needed to rush back to Hogwarts, have dinner, return to the common room, and complete the planetary diagram for astronomy class while continuing to grumble about Professor Blaine's physical education class. When Harry walked out of the bathroom and returned to the dim dormitory room, he was taken aback by the scene before him and fell into a brief silence. Dean and Seamus had made it clear the previous night that they intended to drop out of Professor Blaine's physical education class. Once they quit, there would be no turning back, as Professor Blaine had warned them on the first day. Ron hadn't expressed his decision the night before, but now his actions spoke for him. Harry's and Ron's beds were next to each other, and Ron must have heard him get up, yet he lay motionless, his head covered with the quilt. Even through the bedding, Harry could sense Ron's guilt. "Neville," Harry began, noticing Neville slowly getting off his bed. Neville seemed to realize something as he looked at the other 3 unmoving beds, then turned his gaze to Harry with a slightly bewildered expression. From the day they entered Hogwarts, Harry and Ron had been nearly inseparable. They belonged to the same house, shared the same dormitory, and took the same classes. Harry spent far more time with Ron than with Hermione. Hermione often spent her time in the library, and since the start of their 3rd year, she had taken more subjects than Harry and Ron, meaning she spent less time with them than before. "Come on, Neville," Harry urged, feeling a bit stuck, but choosing not to wake Ron, who was pretending to be asleep. Harry himself wasn't sure if he could hold on. A late arrival will be considered an abandonment by Professor Blaine. When Harry and Neville arrived at the Quidditch Club, most of the students had already gathered. The Gryffindor students immediately realized what had happened when they saw only Harry and Neville. "This fool!" Ginny exclaimed, her hair neatly arranged, looking like a lion cub. It was rare for her not to stutter in front of Harry, and she said angrily, "If it weren't for Professor Blaine, he and we would all have perished in the Chamber of Secrets." "It's no big deal, Ginny," Harry replied in an understated tone. "Professor Blaine won't mind this. Maybe I'll give up in a couple of days." Before Harry and Neville arrived, Ginny, Hermione, and a Ravenclaw second-year girl were already there. Harry now knew her name was Luna Lovegood. She was a bit odd and not particularly likable, but she never seemed to care about that. She continued to dress herself in those peculiar things every day. The day was filled with confusion as 3 girls engaged in conversation. Harry anticipated that Hermione would react with anger, much like Ginny. Indeed, Hermione appeared upset. Her lips were pressed tightly together, her delicate eyebrows arched high, and her eyes seemed to question her own thoughts. Yet, in the end, Hermione merely moved her lips without uttering a word, her expression darkening as if she had remained silent all night. "Your friend made the wrong decision," Luna remarked, waving her hand in the air with her usual enigmatic flair. She often communicated in this peculiar manner, though few could decipher her meaning. He shouldn't have given up this interesting class. Interesting? To be honest, this assessment was not shared by others. Even Ginny and Hermione didn't find the course engaging. They had only persisted for various reasons. To the young wizards, it was likely the dullest class, a time when they could catch up on sleep during Professor Binns's lectures. "Hey, Potter!" Malfoy, ever attuned to the misfortunes surrounding Harry, called out from a dozen feet away, a smirk plastered on his face. "Your freckle-faced friend abandoned you. Ha! Look at your ugly face!" "Go away, Malfoy!" Before Harry could respond, Hermione and Ginny shouted in unison, their voices echoing in astonishment among the onlookers. End of this chapter. Chapter 376. For some time now, Atticus Blaine had made it a habit to arrive at the playground precisely 2 minutes before the hour. Today was no exception. As he approached the club, he noticed the young wizards already lined up according to their respective houses, eagerly awaiting his arrival. The early morning air carried a chill, but Atticus detected an underlying tension, almost like the scent of gunpowder. Raising an eyebrow, he surveyed the somber groups. He caught a glint of schadenfreude in Draco's eyes and instinctively glanced towards the back row of Gryffindor. There, Harry and his friends were deliberately avoiding his gaze. Noticing Ron's absence from the lineup, Atticus quickly deduced the source of the conflict. To be honest, Atticus felt a twinge of disappointment. The Weasley children, in terms of talent, ranked above average among the young wizards at Hogwarts. Even Ron, who was often considered the most ordinary, possessed abilities that were on par with his peers, like Neville Longbottom. However, Ron lacked Neville's resilience. As an old saying from a past life went, everyone has their own destiny, which cannot be forced. This truth was harsh. The young wizards before him might not yet realize that a seemingly trivial decision could lead them down divergent paths in the future. Take Harry, Hermione, and Ron, for instance. Both Hermione and Harry bore the weight of saving the world, and each had distinct personal strengths. Ron, by comparison, seemed less remarkable. Without new bonds to strengthen their trio, it seemed inevitable that they would drift apart. It was reminiscent of Sirius's group. Their friendship had been extraordinary, yet only Sirius and Harry's father, Remus, maintained a close relationship after graduation. Remus, preferring solitude, would likely have seen their contact dwindle, becoming mere acquaintances, if not for the events involving Peter. Professor Blaine had clearly noticed Ron's absence, and Harry's worried expression betrayed his unease. Atticus allowed himself a brief moment of reflection before addressing the young faces before him. With a warm smile, he encouraged them. "What are you waiting for, everyone? Let's get started." At the onset of Professor Blaine's morning practice, none of the students could complete it successfully. Even those who managed to endure half of it were rare. Most found themselves utterly exhausted after a few laps, barely able to stagger through the remainder. However, after half a month of perseverance, their performance, though still lacking, had improved. Now, they could support each other as they completed the morning jog around the playground and returned to the castle. Perhaps to accommodate them, the school had begun serving breakfast earlier. As they passed the hall, the aroma of food filled the air, but Harry had lost his appetite. He headed straight upstairs, with Hermione following suit. Harry glanced at Hermione, whose expression was icy, and tentatively ventured, Hermione." His attempt at conversation was like poking a hornet's nest. Hermione snorted loudly, her gaze so intense that Harry found himself unable to meet her eyes. "Tell Weasley," she declared, her voice echoing through the corridor and disturbing several sleeping portraits. "Don't expect me to forgive him. He won't be copying my homework anymore." Harry could only manage a wry smile in response. The dormitory scene was unchanged from when they had left. Ron, Seamus, and Dean were still bundled in their beds, groggy and half awake, as if the morning had barely begun. The three seemed to have truly fallen asleep again. In fact, Ron's decision to give up wasn't something that angered Harry. It reminded him of when Hermione was displeased with Ron for dropping several seemingly important courses. However, Ron should have given them a heads up. It was foreseeable that Hermione and Ron would soon find themselves in another Cold War, just like the one they had over Scabbers. How long would it last this time? Harry wasn't in the mood to ponder it further. With this question lingering in his mind, he collapsed onto his bed with a thud and quickly fell asleep. It wasn't until the red sun was shining and laughter echoed inside and outside the castle that Harry awoke. He was alone in the dormitory. The others who had slept in had already risen. Glancing at the time on the alarm clock on his desk, Harry jumped up with a start. After a hurried cleanup, he dashed downstairs. He found Ron playing chess with Seamus in the common room. The two quickly left the lounge and ran downstairs. As they reached the foyer, they saw Sirius waving to them at the bottom of the steps outside the castle. "Walking and talking," Sirius suggested. It was a day off, and he had swapped his usual attire for a casual leather jacket, his hair tied back, resembling the lead singer of a Muggle band. Sirius noticed that both Harry and Ron had something on their minds. He wrapped his arms around their shoulders, smiling warmly. Hermione is still waiting for us in Hogsmeade. Ron's face turned slightly awkward. Clearly, he had already encountered Hermione while Harry was catching up on sleep. Harry couldn't wait any longer and blurted out the question that had been on his mind. "What do you think, Sirius?" Though Harry's question was vague, he was certain Sirius understood, as there was no surprise or confusion on his face. Instead of answering immediately, Sirius raised an eyebrow and looked at Ron, saying regretfully, "Without a doubt, Ron, you made a rash decision." Harry knew Sirius was trying to spare Ron's feelings. The word he truly wanted to use was wrong, not reckless. Exactly. Harry had to quicken his pace to keep up with Sirius. He asked curiously, "Do you think Professor Blaine's Muggle PE class is meaningful? I don't understand. Hogwarts is full of wizards, right? For a wizard, what's the use of running faster or longer?" Harry's question seemed to lighten Ron's mood, and his expression brightened. "That's it," Ron nodded in agreement. "We are wizards, aren't we? Quidditch is the sport we should play. Seamus and I discussed this. Professor Blaine might want to improve our skills, but he should teach us powerful magic, like how he defeated Greyback's gang of werewolves, or, like in Defense Against the Dark Arts, teach us how to handle dark creatures." As they passed through the school gate guarded by Filch and stepped onto the green path leading to Hogsmeade, Sirius spoke again. "I haven't known Atticus Blaine as long as you, Harry and Ron, but I think I understand him a bit better. First, let me assure you that he's not a wizard who wastes time on pointless things," Sirius said with conviction. "In my 30 years, I've seen many wizards with extraordinary skills, but none compare to Dumbledore or Voldemort." Sirius glanced at Harry and Ron, who were listening intently. "I once thought there might be no one else who could rival Dumbledore and Voldemort. Although Voldemort is evil, it is natural for him. To be powerful is a rare gift. After witnessing Atticus Blaine's skill, I am absolutely convinced that his strength rivals that of the most formidable wizards. Do you understand what I mean? A wise and powerful wizard like Atticus possesses a perspective far beyond that of ordinary wizards. Perhaps only someone like Dumbledore could truly comprehend his actions, while the rest of us remain in the dark. However, one thing is certain, Atticus is not someone to be underestimated. Any attempt to do so would simply be a waste of energy." End of this chapter. Chapter 377, The Exciting Summer Vacation. Sirius didn't explain to Harry and Ron why Professor Blaine had organized such a mundane Muggle PE class, but his stance was clear. He encouraged Harry to persevere. As for Ron, he had already lost his eligibility, so there was no point in discussing persistence. Ron appeared a bit disgruntled, clearly hoping Sirius would validate his decision to quit. Instead, he received the opposite response. The atmosphere was tense for a moment, but Ron's mood lifted when Sirius mentioned the upcoming Quidditch World Cup that summer. "You can't imagine the grandeur of the World Cup, Harry," Ron said excitedly. "It's hard to get a ticket, but Dad usually manages to get one. How about it, Harry? Come over early and let's go see it together." Harry was well aware of the Quidditch World Cup, having read about it in numerous Quidditch-related books. However, he hadn't realized that this year's event would be held in England. The unpleasant topic of Professor Blaine was quickly forgotten as Harry looked at Sirius with excitement. The answer from Sirius, who was smiling broadly, made Harry's heart race with anticipation. "My plan is, once summer vacation starts, I'll talk to your aunt and uncle. We'll get your things out of the Dursleys' house and move them to 12 Grimmauld Place, the old Black family home. You can live there with me if you'd like," Sirius said. "You have your own house!" Harry exclaimed, his excitement palpable. "You mean I can leave the Dursleys and live with you?" Sirius seemed to misunderstand Harry's enthusiasm, his expression turning slightly awkward. "Of course, you've lived with a Muggle family for 12 years, so maybe you're more accustomed to it." "Are you kidding?" Harry interrupted, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Of course, I want to leave the Dursleys. If Professor McGonagall allows it, I could take a couple of days off to move my things now." A broad smile spread across Sirius' face once more. "Don't be so hasty. I need to inform Atticus about this plan first. Due to certain circumstances, the house is currently under his ownership. Of course, I have the right to use it, and I'm sure Atticus wouldn't mind if you moved in. Now back to our discussion. Sirius pursed his lips, his tone light. After we get you out of the Dursleys, I think Ron's suggestion is great. You can stay with him for a while. Harry was more than willing to visit the burrow. Ron's parents, the Weasleys, had always been kind to him, treating him almost like another son. However, he was curious why Sirius, who cared so much for him, would send him to the burrow. I promised Atticus that I would accompany him on some errands, which will take about 2 to 3 weeks. After that, I'll pick you up from the burrow, and we'll watch the World Cup together. For Harry, it was like a dream come true. The long-held desire to leave the Dursleys was finally going to be realized this summer. He had never anticipated a summer with such eagerness. Sirius's plans continued as they crossed the sign at the entrance to Hogsmeade. For the rest of the time, after the World Cup, we'll see how things go. Harry, we don't know how long the Quidditch match between Bulgaria and Ireland will last. Harry was puzzled. As Gryffindor's seeker, he had played many matches at Hogwarts, none lasting more than half a day. The last time Luxembourg and Uganda played, it lasted 5 days, Ron explained to Harry. The longest record in history is 1 month. Wow! Harry's green eyes sparkled with excitement. I hope it's the same this time. A match that lasts for a month is definitely a nightmare for the Ministry of Magic, Sirius chuckled, glancing at Harry, who was so excited he could barely contain himself. In that moment, Sirius was reminded of James. The two of them had often discussed Quidditch with the same fervor. After that, Sirius continued, his voice softening, if time permits, I'd like you to come with me to Godric's Hollow. You've been living with those muggles, and I suppose you haven't been here yet? Godric's Hollow? The smile on Harry's face froze, and his heart felt as if it had been struck by a bludger. It was the place where he was born and where his parents were killed. Despite all his years in the wizarding world, Harry had never thought to visit. It was as if he had been avoiding it instinctively. Yet now that Sirius mentioned it, Harry felt a sudden longing, even stronger than his desire to leave the Dursleys or attend the Quidditch World Cup. Sirius, can we? Oh, here we are, Sirius interrupted, his voice tinged with emotion. The Three Broomsticks. How many years has it been since I was last here? The Three Broomsticks was a beloved spot for young wizards in Hogsmeade. Its owner, Madame Rosmerta, was over a certain age but still maintained a graceful figure. Many young wizards, including Ron, didn't mind paying her a bit of extra attention. Today, the bar was as crowded, noisy, and smoky as ever. Madame Rosmerta was so busy, she didn't notice Sirius Black's presence. Ron's face took on an unnatural look as he spotted Hermione and Ginny sitting where they had eavesdropped on the Minister of Magic's conversation last time. The two girls by the window appeared solemn, as if deep in thought. Harry and Ron exchanged puzzled glances, unsure of what the girls were up to. It wasn't until they approached the table that they noticed it was cluttered with empty bottles. Behind the shelf, Professor Blaine and Percy were engaged in conversation along with Percy's girlfriend, Penelope Clearwater of Ravenclaw. Are you eavesdropping on Atticus's chat? Sirius laughed. Shh! Hermione immediately put her finger to her lips, blushing when she realized who had spoken. Oh, sorry, Professor Black. We didn't, Professor Blaine hasn't noticed us. It's not class right now, Hermione. Just call me Sirius, he replied. The three of them found stools and sat down. Hermione still seemed displeased with Harry and Ron, but at least she wasn't as cold as she had been that morning. Perhaps something else had caught her attention. So, what did you all hear? Sirius asked. It seemed unlikely that a wizard like Atticus would be overheard by 2 underage witches unless he didn't mind the content of his conversation being overheard. Harry had interacted with Percy often, but hadn't had much contact with his girlfriend. The Weasley siblings liked to tease Percy about his girlfriend, which made him reluctant to let his Ravenclaw girlfriend get too close to them. What's the matter with her nose? Harry wondered aloud. In his opinion, Percy's girlfriend looked quite nice, not as unattractive as Fred and George sometimes joked. Her hairstyle was similar to that of Cho Chang's friends, though their hair colors differed. In the bustling bar, Penelope looked downcast. She lowered her head, trying to let her hair cover her face, but Harry noticed a white bandage on her nose through the strands. "I told you," Ginny shrugged, looking indifferent. She dozed off in Snape's class and hurt her nose from a splash of potion. Percy was upset for days. Fred said, "It was actually quite good, as it effectively concealed the pimple on her nose amidst her freckles." End of this chapter. Chapter 378, The Troubles of Graduation Season. Ron covered his mouth and snickered, but the stern looks from Ginny and Hermione quickly made him feel awkward. He was being regarded as a traitor by everyone because he was the first to drop the course taught by Professor Blaine. So, Atticus Blaine took a sip of the violet water, maintaining a calm demeanor. "You asked me out today because you hope I can help you with a letter of recommendation for an internship in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement." Percy, now an adult wizard on the brink of graduation, was almost indistinguishable in stature from Professor Blaine. However, his youthful features still bore a hint of inexperience. Currently, Percy was the top student at Hogwarts, serving as the president of the Boys' Student Council, a position appointed by Dumbledore. Nearly every professor who had taught him praised his abilities, and Atticus held no ill will towards him. Percy was a wizard with both character and ambition, and his self-motivation was particularly noteworthy. Writing a recommendation letter for a young wizard was not an uncommon request. When Atticus graduated, Snape had subtly suggested that if he wished to work at the Ministry of Magic, he could arrange a recommendation, despite not having deep connections there himself. Atticus was surprised at the time, as Professor Snape was not known for meddling in such matters. In hindsight, it seemed likely that Dumbledore had made the suggestion, hoping to keep Atticus within his watchful eye, lest he stray from the right path. "Yes, Professor Blaine," Percy nodded respectfully, his eyes filled with admiration. "Perhaps you already know that I plan to work at the Ministry of Magic after graduation, but I'm not familiar with the departments there. Recently, I wrote to my father, asking which department would be best for personal development. He told me that the two most prestigious departments are the Department of Magical Law Enforcement and the Department of International Magical Cooperation. He also mentioned that you have a personal relationship with the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, Miss Amelia Bones. I mean, a friendship. If you recommend me, Miss Bones wouldn't refuse." While it was true that Amelia would not disregard Atticus's recommendation, it depended on who was being recommended. Percy, a member of the Weasley family and an outstanding student, would certainly be a candidate worth considering. Even Fudge would likely heed such a recommendation. However, Atticus noticed the burning ambition in Percy's eyes, a desire for power that made him frown inwardly. While ambition was commendable, it could easily lead one astray if not tempered with wisdom. After a moment of contemplation, Atticus slowly shook his head. "I'm sorry, Percy, but I'm afraid I can't agree to your request." In the bustling bar, Professor Blaine's gentle refusal struck Percy like a bolt of lightning, leaving him momentarily stunned. Miss Clearwater, who sat beside Percy, trying to conceal her thoughts, and Hermione and the others, who were eavesdropping from a few seats away, all looked equally bewildered. But, Percy stammered, his face flushed with indignation as if he had been insulted. "Why, Professor Blaine, don't you think I'm good enough?" "On the contrary, Percy," Professor Blaine replied calmly. He didn't immediately explain, but instead posed a question. "The Newt's exam is approaching, Percy. I heard from Professor McGonagall that you are currently taking a total of 12 compulsory and elective subjects. That's amazing. How many certificates do you think you can earn?" Atticus Blaine asked, his curiosity piqued. 12, Percy declared proudly, puffing out his chest. "And if all goes well, I'll excel in each of these 12 courses." Atticus smiled and nodded slightly. 12 Newt certificates will guarantee you a place in the Ministry of Magic. No department would refuse you, Percy. He adjusted his posture, leaning forward with an air of authority. "So, why are you so fixated on my recommendation letter? You have the ability to achieve your goals on your own. Using my recommendation could lead to criticism or even targeting. You know I have my share of adversaries in the ministry. This could hinder your future prospects, limiting your endless possibilities." Percy was taken aback, realizing he hadn't considered this perspective. "With your intelligence, you shouldn't have overlooked this," Atticus continued, tapping the table with his fingers for emphasis. "But the flame of greed in your heart has clouded your judgment. And as for you—" Atticus turned his gaze to Miss Clearwater, who had been listening quietly. "Penelope, Professor Flitwick mentioned a few Ravenclaw students aspiring to join the Ministry of Magic. Your name wasn't among them. As the prefect of Ravenclaw, you certainly have the capability." "Oh, I'm sorry, Professor," Penelope stammered, surprised by the sudden shift in conversation. Her expression darkened. "I might not intend to work at the Ministry of Magic." "Why?" The question, filled with shock and anger, came not from Atticus but from Percy. He stared at his girlfriend of 2 years in disbelief, having always assumed she would join him at the ministry. Penelope lowered her head, her hair failing to conceal the sadness in her eyes and the tears that fell onto her robe. Atticus tapped the table again, reminding Percy to mind his tone. "Although I'm not the head of Ravenclaw, Penelope, since we're discussing this, why don't you share your plans?" "My mother is a Muggle, and my father is a half-blood wizard, Professor," Penelope began, her voice tinged with emotion. "When my dad was at Hogwarts, the wizarding world wasn't welcoming to half-blood wizards. He harbors prejudices against the ministry and the wizarding world. He believes I won't have a promising future there. So, he doesn't want me to remain in the wizarding world after graduation. My grandfather and mother also hope that after Hogwarts, I can return to Gloucestershire to help with the family farm." A heavy atmosphere settled over them, and the surrounding chatter seemed to quiet. Not only Harry and his friends, but many other students were eavesdropping on the conversation. Atticus discreetly cast a spell to muffle their discussion, then turned his attention to Percy. Despite hearing Penelope's situation, Percy's anger only intensified, distorting his handsome features. "But until today, you never told me any of this." "I thought you'd be ashamed, Percy," Penelope replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Atticus's eyes grew deep and penetrating, finally bringing Percy back to a semblance of self-control. His aggressive demeanor softened. "As far as I know, Miss Penelope is your girlfriend, isn't she? You've been together for quite some time. How is it that you know nothing about her family? Has Penelope hidden the truth from you, or have you simply not paid attention?" Atticus Blaine had always been deeply engrossed in planning his own future, often to the point of neglecting Penelope's feelings and aspirations. This oversight had become a recurring issue, one that he was only now beginning to recognize. As he sat in quiet reflection, the weight of his actions settled heavily upon him, prompting a newfound determination to change. End of this chapter. Chapter 379, Future Directions. Percy's face was pale, and he was speechless for a moment. Penelope lowered her head, tears welling up in her eyes. Observing their distress, Atticus Blaine also lost interest and the desire to speak. Hatred, it seems, is hereditary. Penelope hails from a family of half-blood wizards. Her father personally experienced the perilous conditions that Muggles and half-blood wizards faced in the magical world during Voldemort's reign. As a father, it is only natural for him to wish for his daughter to live in a stable and safe society. Percy, on the other hand, comes from the Weasley family, one of the 28 sacred pure-blood families. Although Lucius Malfoy views the Weasleys as a shabby family and a disgrace to pure-blood wizards, he still acknowledges their significance. Last year, in an attempt to trouble Arthur, Lucius even slipped Voldemort's Horcrux into Ginny's school bag. Despite their financial struggles, the Weasleys' extensive connections are invaluable. With Percy's background and his own talents, it is foreseeable that his future in the Ministry of Magic will be promising. In school, the class divide caused by such backgrounds is less pronounced, but upon entering the Wizarding Society, harsh realities become apparent. Recently, when Atticus himself gained fame, some troublemakers jested that he might become the Minister of Magic. Atticus dismissed this as a joke, knowing that within the current structure of Wizarding Society, he could only influence from the periphery. The likes of Cornelius Fudge, Amelia Bones, Barty Crouch, and other key department leaders have surnames that have been illustrious in magical history for centuries. "Penelope," Percy murmured, attempting to speak. The young witch, silently weeping, suddenly stood up and dashed out of the 3 broomsticks, her face hidden, leaving Harry astonished. Watching her quickly vanish from sight, Percy's expression turned somber, unsure of his next move. It's not that people with different goals can't be together. The real issue is what Professor Blaine's words revealed. What is most important to Percy? Is it power, personal advancement, or love? Percy has long harbored resentment towards his father. He believes his father could have provided a better life for their family by abandoning some stubborn and outdated beliefs, yet he never did, choosing instead a life of mediocrity. Now, Percy understands a bit more. He feels the weight of many eyes upon him, each gaze seemingly filled with reproach. But he believes he has done nothing wrong. He simply wants to improve himself and ensure a better life for his future family. Percy left as well, feeling as distraught as if under the imperious curse. Atticus shook his head gently. He wanted to remind Percy not to forget those who have always been by his side in his pursuit of goals, lest he regret it for the rest of his life. However, it seemed Percy was being drawn into something deeper. As always, individuals have their own destinies, and they cannot be forced. "Ah, a family gathering," Atticus remarked as he approached Harry's table, patting him on the shoulder and smiling at Sirius. "This kind of comfortable life feels pretty good." "Indeed," Sirius replied, raising his glass. "It's all thanks to you, Atticus," Ginny said hesitantly, standing up. "Professor Blaine," she called out, her voice tinged with concern. Not only Ginny and Ron, but also Harry and Hermione shared worried looks. They usually had a good relationship with Percy, and his demeanor when he left was troubling. Atticus had managed to shield them from the details, leaving the younger ones in the dark. "Did they break up?" Ginny asked sadly. Although the Weasley siblings often teased Percy about his girlfriend, seeing him so upset made them genuinely concerned. Ron, momentarily forgetting the awkwardness of meeting Professor Blaine, looked at him eagerly. "It's not true," Atticus replied, shaking his head gently. "Percy and Penelope have a minor disagreement about their future plans. I suggest you don't interfere too much and let them make their own decisions." "Future plans?" The young ones blinked in confusion, not quite grasping what Professor Blaine meant. However, Sirius nodded knowingly, a look of nostalgia and understanding in his eyes. As an adult wizard who had lived through his own youthful years, he understood the implications. "So," Atticus said, glancing at the silent group with a playful wink, "I won't intrude on your happy weekend any longer. I suspect I'm not very popular right now." Harry and Hermione laughed shyly, while Ron looked down, feeling guilty. "Let's have a drink together, Atticus," Sirius suggested with a smile. "They'd love more of your guidance, and I have something to discuss with you." Catching Atticus's curious gaze, Sirius glanced at Harry and smiled warmly. "I plan to take Harry away from his uncle and aunt's house during the summer. I've consulted the necessary people, but I need your approval. I don't have an extra house for Harry and me." "Take Harry away from his uncle and aunt's house?" Atticus looked at Harry, who was trying to hide his excitement, and his eyebrows furrowed slightly. "Have you consulted Dumbledore about this?" "What does Dumbledore have to do with it?" Sirius asked, crossing his legs nonchalantly. "James and Lily entrusted Harry to me. I'm his godfather. It's my right, isn't it? Since Harry has no objections, even Dumbledore can't dictate otherwise." With so many people around, Atticus couldn't explain further. He pondered for a moment. "Go ask Dumbledore, Sirius. He might offer some advice." Professor Blaine's insistence gave Harry a sense of foreboding. He feared his hopes of leaving the Dursleys might be dashed. But then he thought, what reason could Dumbledore have to prevent him from leaving? They barely knew each other, and as Sirius said, the headmaster of Hogwarts had no right to decide where he lived, right? "All right, let's leave it at that for now," Atticus said. "I need to visit Zuko's joke shop to prepare some teaching supplies. If they don't have enough stock, I might have to go to Diagon Alley." With that, Professor Blaine left without hesitation, leaving the group sitting there, puzzled and exchanging glances. "Teaching supplies?" Harry asked, bewildered. "At Zuko's joke shop?" Professor Blaine's last remark became the topic of discussion. Even Sirius couldn't fathom what teaching tools could be found in a joke shop. However, they had planned to visit the small store that afternoon to buy some dung bombs for self-defense. When they finally arrived at Zuko's joke shop and opened the door, they were met with a surprising sight. The commotion in the shop left Harry and the others momentarily stunned. Fred and George were practically wailing, their distress evident. "What's going on?" Sirius was the first to react. He rushed forward, grabbing the twins by their shoulders. "What happened?" "Professor Blaine," George shouted, his voice filled with anger. "He bought all the important items in the store." End of this chapter. Chapter 380. New Changes. After the Easter holiday, the atmosphere at Hogwarts grew increasingly tense. In just over 2 months, the Owls and Newt's exams, which significantly influenced the future of most wizards, would commence. Harry, now in his 3rd year at Hogwarts, hadn't felt this tension in his first 2 years. However, this year was different. Ron's 3 older brothers, Fred, George, and Percy, were all preparing for these crucial exams, and their anxiety was palpable, affecting Harry as well. Sirius was also feeling the pressure. The Defense Against the Dark Arts class was a critical component of these exams, and aside from the half-year when Professors Blaine and Lupin had filled in, the quality of teaching in this subject at Hogwarts had been inconsistent. Sirius, not one to shirk responsibility, had taken on the role of professor to assist Dumbledore, determined not to let incompetence tarnish his reputation. Adding to his stress was a colleague at the staff table who, in a seemingly casual manner, frequently commented on the anticipated test results for the course. This irked Sirius, prompting him to invest considerable time in preparing materials and plans to help the 5th and 7th year students succeed. Consequently, Harry and his friends found it increasingly difficult to spend time with Sirius outside of class. Meanwhile, Percy and Penelope's relationship had ended, a fact relayed by Ginny. She recounted seeing them pass each other in the corridor without acknowledgement after Professor McGonagall's Transfiguration class. Following this, Percy stopped attending Professor Blaine's gym class. This development infuriated Hermione. One evening, as they descended from the astronomy tower after observing planetary orbits, she vented her frustration. "Percy, I can't believe it. Is he using Professor Blaine as an excuse? Did he drop the course just because he didn't get a recommendation from him?" Hermione fumed. "He's been under a lot of stress lately," Ron replied, unusually bold in the face of Hermione's anger. "Since Professor Blaine is unwilling to write a recommendation for him, his chances of entering the Ministry of Magic are uncertain. That's been his goal since he started at Hogwarts." "That doesn't mean he can," Hermione began, but Ron's words made her pause. "He's also dealing with emotional setbacks," Ron continued. "He's exhausted, and Blaine's physical education class is the best way to channel our excess energy." Harry wanted to remind Ron that "our" wasn't quite accurate, as Ron had skipped the class for 2 weeks. 2 weeks! Harry's exclamation nearly caused Neville, who was ahead of them, to stumble down the stairs in fright. "What?" Neville asked, confused, as he leaned against the wall, rubbing his sprained ankle. Harry glanced at Hermione and Ron, who were both looking at him with curiosity. "Did you forget?" Harry quickly explained. "It's been another 2 weeks. I mean, Professor Blaine's physical education class has been going on for a month now. He mentioned at the start that the first stage would last a month, and there would be new changes afterward. That means," Hermione's cheeks flushed with excitement, revealing her true feelings, "we don't need to." She stopped abruptly, noticing Ron's amused expression. "I think it's good to persevere," Neville said, pausing in front of the portrait of the fat lady, and turned to face them. Atticus Blaine gazed at them with a sense of loss. "Nobody's stopping you from going on." "Neville," Ron pouted. "Excuse me. I guess you must have forgotten your password again." In truth, Neville was right. Over the past few days, even Harry began to realize that Professor Blaine's class wasn't entirely useless. After overcoming the initial discomfort, he noticed a marked improvement in his mental energy. He was no longer as prone to drowsiness, even in Snape's potions class or Professor Binns's lectures. He could resist the urge to doze off and actually listen for a while. Before closing his eyes each night, Harry was filled with anticipation for the next day. Although he no longer disliked the Muggle PE class, he still looked forward to new developments in Professor Blaine's lessons. Rumors spread quickly that Professor Blaine had visited Zuko's joke shop to purchase big dung eggs as teaching tools. The next day, the number of young wizards attending his class dropped by a fifth. Now, half a month later, only a little more than a third of the original group of over 100 remained. April had arrived, and the morning breeze on the field had lost its chill, replaced by a pleasant coolness that brushed against their faces and through their hair. Harry squinted at the greenish morning light, silently adjusting his breathing, a technique he had discovered to relieve fatigue during prolonged exercise. "Let's start," Professor Blaine announced as he arrived at the playground, right on time. He seemed unaware that a month had passed. Dressed in his usual sportswear, he gave his instructions in a calm tone. Harry couldn't hide his disappointment as he looked around, noticing that the other young wizards shared his sentiment. Professor Blaine, Hermione, never one to hide her concerns, frowned and raised her hand. "If I remember correctly," she began, taking a deep breath and fixing her bright eyes on Professor Blaine, "you mentioned that our phased practice would last for a month, and after that, our courses would undergo some changes?" "Thank you for the reminder, Miss Granger." Professor Blaine nodded slightly. "Yes, that's the plan. Our physical education class is about to enter the next stage. This morning will be the last time you get up early for a morning run." As he looked around at the excited young wizards, Atticus smiled slightly, choosing not to dampen their spirits just yet. "Starting today, we will enter the second phase of the course. Classes will be held every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 3 to 4:30 p.m. in the Labyrinth classroom." The Labyrinth classroom was where Professor Blaine had once tasked Harry with dealing with the Inferi in the second half of the previous semester. It was also the venue for the intriguing boat race held last year. Hearing that the next class would be in that classroom, the young wizards grew even more excited. After persevering for so long, Professor Blaine was finally going to show them something interesting. The news that Professor Blaine's physical education class might become more engaging spread throughout the castle during lunch, sparking great curiosity among the young wizards. However, those who had once been eligible to participate but lost their chance by giving up didn't seem very pleased. After dinner, Harry and his friends hurriedly completed their History of Magic thesis in an hour. Then, under Ron's sullen gaze, they quickly left the lounge and rushed to the exclusive classroom. When the clock struck 8 in the evening, the young wizards eagerly gathered in the corridor, pushing open the classroom door and filing in one by one. Once everyone had squeezed inside, the room seemed to stretch endlessly, with walls extending a quarter of a mile. Newly installed torches flickered to life with a soft whimper, casting a sudden, bright glow across the room. Under this newfound light, the objects placed against the 3 walls began to emit crisp clicking sounds. "What are those?" whispered Hannah Abbott from Hufflepuff, her eyes wide as she gazed at the polished items reflecting the firelight. Neville Longbottom, standing nearby, exclaimed in horror, "Those are the armors from the corridor.